Everyone. All right, great. I am Horace Mitchell, and it has been my privilege and honor to serve our community as president of CSU Bakersfield over the past 14 years. And it is my pleasure to join our other sponsors, co-sponsors, in having you here for this 18th annual Kern County Economic Summit. At CSU Bakersfield, we know that we cannot achieve working alone all the things that we want to achieve for our community and our students. And so we have developed what we refer to as partnerships for excellence. And these partnerships are intended to increase the level of educational attainment in our communities, enhance the quality of life, develop more well-educated professionals for the workforce, and also support regional economic development. This Kern County Economic Summit is one such partnership. This is a partnership among CSU Bakersfield, the Greater Bakersfield Chamber of Commerce, and the Kern Economic Development Corporation. Economists from the School of Business and Public Administration at CSUB have been regular participants and presenters at this summit, and that is true again this year, where two of our economists will be making presentations, along with all of the other outstanding presentations that will be made by the speakers today. So again, welcome. We're glad that you're here.
Good morning. Well, thank you for coming here today, and the way I see today is about cross-pollination. We are in Ag County after all. It's about folks chatting today, different industry sectors here, a chance for all of us to come together once a year, but also to serve as ambassadors for Kern County. We have a great story to tell, and we're going to hear about where we're headed, not just locally, but regionally, nationally, and globally. And what we're coming out of this meeting today, I think, is an enthusiasm and excitement about our incredible economic vitality and how well positioned we are. And again, it's a testament to all of your hard work, and we're excited for you to hear the story today. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Nick Ortiz. I'm the CEO of the Greater Bakersfield Chamber of Commerce. I want to thank all of you for being here this morning at the 18th Annual Kern Economic Summit. As Dr. Mitchell mentioned, this is an amazing partnership between three organizations that have long ties into the community and are really focused on improving our community, providing that drive to the economic engine, and really, as business people, you know that without a thriving private sector, that no city, no county can thrive. So as Richard said, I think today is going to be, and you're going to hear some things about telling our story, about what we're doing, about how we interact with the nation and the world. And I think one of the things this year that we've all been focused on is ensuring that people in Bakersfield and Kern County are proud of where we come from. We're proud of what we do in terms of feeding the world, fueling the world, defending the world. That is what Kern County does. So thank you all again for being here. I want to just very quickly thank the folks behind the scenes who help us put these events together. So from CSUB, thank you very much to the School of Business and Public Administration and University Advancement for all of your help. From KEDC, the whole KEDC staff, thank you, but specifically Tamara Baker. From my team, thank you to my team. You saw them when you were registering, but specifically Gene Scheiber, our Director of Operations, and then also our contract consultant, who if you are a sponsor, a table sponsor, you're a speaker, you heard a lot from her, and that's Kim Schaefer from Kim Schaefer and Associates. And if you could join me in just giving the staff folks who put this together a big hand. Now, anything that we do as the Chamber or EDC or Cal State, we need the private sector support. And so today we are very excited and very lucky to have the support of two great healthcare organizations in Kern County. So please help me welcome our platinum sponsors, Charlotte Briggs, the CEO of Adventist Health Bakersfield, and David Womack, Executive Vice President of Kaiser Permanente.
So welcome. At Adventist Health Bakersfield, we have a tagline, it's Together Inspired. And whether we call it partnership or whatever we end up calling it, it's really together is where we make a difference. And part of our co-sponsoring today is with Kaiser Permanente, which is a partner of ours. But as we look at really for me and Adventist Health Bakersfield, we're proud to be part of the community, the healthcare community here in Bakersfield. We're inspired to work with people, whether that's other businesses or whether that's people individually. And once again, as we look at the 18th annual Kern Economic Summit, and what really brings it together, and I mean, I look at the gentlemen that were up here today, and you look at the chamber, whether it's CSUB or the Kern Economic Group, to me, that's really what inspired really means, inspired together.
So we believe very much in the power of partnership, and Charlotte and I particularly believe in it because of the results we see of that every single day as we care for our members and for the patients in Adventist Health Bakersfield. And we actually have invited one of them here to tell you their story, and we'd like to show that to you right now.
The fact that I just had 2 newborn babies and I have 2 older daughters, and the fact that I might not make it through this, I can't even tell you the fear that was running through my heart. I was planning my funeral in my head at this point. I was a new Kaiser member at the time, so I immediately started my prenatal care, and it was all a new experience, and I just wanted to make sure that I gave my babies the best chance at a healthy start. So went to all my visits, saw my doctor regularly. About 28 weeks, Kaiser did a test on me to see if I had gestational diabetes. And they did one when I was first, when I first went in as pregnant, but that one came up negative. But then again, at 28 weeks, I found out that I did have gestational diabetes. And that was a pretty big shock for me. I didn't really see it coming. They gave me very realistic expectations. First of all, just having twins, they set out the expectation that I'm probably going to have them early. They told me I was going to have a C-section. So I went to Adventist Health, and I had a really great experience there. All of the nursing staff, they were fantastic. They made me feel comfortable. I definitely had some apprehensions about the fact that my doctors were all Kaiser doctors and I was going to Adventist to have my babies. I don't think I really understood the fact that they always had a Kaiser doctor on call just for this purpose. I felt like I was in good hands. Everybody was watching me, they were paying attention to me, they were listening to me. The nurses, they were amazing, and they provided this level of comfort that I needed because I was incredibly scared to have this C-section. But because they're twins and they were born at 35 weeks, they did have to go to the NICU. They were only in there for a few days, but it was a critical few days because those are the days that I was recovering from my C-section. And so I had the Kaiser pediatrician as well as the Kaiser doctors that were coming to see me as I was recovering from my C-section. So I saw a lot of that collaboration happening right in front of me while I was recovering and my babies were getting better. These may be nurses from Adventist and this may be my doctor from Kaiser, but they both have the same information. The fact that they were working together so seamlessly to where that wasn't something on my mind, that wasn't a concern of mine. I understood that they were working together for my care and that I was getting the best care possible. So without that there, I can't tell you that I would have been able to recover the way that I did. So I went through a lot during my pregnancy. You know, in my health scares and through the delivery and having the babies and myself getting sick right after having the babies and my recovery after having the babies, it was definitely a long year for me. But my babies are almost a year old now. They are thriving. And it's amazing. I feel so blessed to have these 2 new additions to our home. My family's doubled in size and doubled in love. I just feel like I'm in a completely different place. I've been through so much to get to this point, and now I'm in this beautiful place with my children, is the best way I could describe it.
So we see stories like Nicole's every day that demonstrate the power of our partnership and the power of partnership of all of us. Because to a large degree, Nicole's story is an economic story. She has a good job, good benefits, she has access to great care. If we want to improve the health of our community, which I know we all do, it's largely an economic issue. So our hope for you, for all of us today, is that we walk out those doors together inspired to really create a dynamic and just roaring economic environment for our community. That's what's going to make a difference for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
It is now my pleasure to introduce the first of our distinguished speakers that we'll have during the day. Jeremy Adams completed a teaching credential at CSUB in 1999 and earned a master's degree in education in 2000. He is not your average he's not your average civics teacher. And let me tell you why. Jeremy Adams is a distinguished and highly decorated Bakersfield High School civics teacher, best known as the founder of the Earl Warren Cup Constitutional Competition, the Super Bowl of local high school competitions. And here's why that is so significant. He has landed as question posers. President George W. Bush, Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, Prime Minister Tony Blair, and former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, among many other big names. He has written 2 books, including one entitled The Secrets of Timeless Teachers, that has been used widely across the state of California. And he has contributed to the Washington Post, C-SPAN, the Educator's Room, and he writes a regular column for the Huffington Post. Now, how many civics faculty members do you know who do that? Jeremy is a highly sought-after keynote speaker, infusing every talk with wit, wisdom, and enthusiasm. He has been named Kern County Teacher of the Year by the Kern County Superintendent of Schools Office, the California Teacher of the Year by the Daughters of the American Revolution. He was a semifinalist for California Teacher of the Year by the California Board of Education, and a finalist for the Carlson Family Foundation National Teacher Award. We're talking about someone who is just really quite outstanding. Jeremy has maintained strong ties with CSUB as a lecturer, commencement speaker, keynote speaker, and CSUB Alumni Association Board Secretary. It was my pleasure a few weeks ago, along with the president of the CSU Bakersfield Alumni Association, to induct Jeremy into the CSU Bakersfield Alumni Hall of Fame. He is the first classroom teacher to be so recognized. And the California State Senate recently sponsored a resolution in recognition of his achievements in education. As I said before, Jeremy is no average civics teacher. He is an outstanding person. He gives of his time freely in working with students, not only in his class, but other students as well. And he is someone that we were very proud to induct into our Alumni Hall of Fame because he epitomizes the values of CSUB in terms of being a servant leader who does all that he can to help with that important goal that I mentioned earlier, which is supporting educational attainment in our community. So, that being said, please join me in welcoming Jeremy Adams.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Appreciate it. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. It's wonderful to see all of you again. I appreciate the promotion. Last year I was the warm-up act for the keynote speaker. This year I get to be the opening act. I'll be honest. I asked for a little bit of direction. Well, what does it mean to be the first speaker every morning? And they said, one rule, the Kern Economic Summit, if you're the first speaker. Don't be boring. Now, I start every day of my life teaching 40 seniors AP macroeconomics. I guarantee you are an easier audience than they are in the second semester, no question about it. I also want to thank the people who organized this for this lovely advertisement. In the bottom right-hand corner there, it says I was backed by popular demand. I had friends, some people might call them haters, like Amanda Frank, who made fun of me for this, but I have to tell you, this really helped me in my relationship with my older brothers. Anybody who's the youngest child knows that no matter what you achieve as the youngest child, you don't know anything ever. So I screenshotted this, and whenever they gave me any grief, I said, hey, I'm backed by popular demand. So take that. So with that in mind, I wanted to give a very different kind of speech this year. So let's jump right on in there. Have you noticed lately that the most popular word in the English language, especially on social media and in media of all forms, is the word crisis? At any given time, we are suffering in this country from an environmental crisis, an economic crisis, an education crisis, a healthcare crisis, a national security. Come on, everybody. Crisis. I told you I could get you involved. You're already better than my first period class. Now, the reason why this bothers me so much is because it obscures the fundamental reality that the young people, the men and women who I spend every day with, some people might say I'm in the trenches of the culture, it obscures their view of life and the world itself. Because the reality is, the young people sitting in my classroom every day are, no questions asked, the luckiest human beings to ever walk the face of the planet. The information, the data, the research is overwhelming. As an example, fewer people in the world today are starving than at any other point in human history. Did you know that in the last 100 years, average IQ in the world has gone up by 30 points? Now, for those of you who think, well, that has to be a matter of genetics, consider this. Brains need calories. Probably not as many as I give my brain, but they need nutrition nonetheless. Not only that, extreme poverty is down by 60%. Do you know what happened yesterday, my friends? 137,000 people in the world rose above the poverty line. Do you know what happened 2 days ago? 137,000 people rose above the poverty line. And the day before, and the day before, every day for the last 25 years in the world, 137,000 people have risen above the poverty line. Arthur Brooks of the American Enterprise Institute says it is the best news that the world never hears about. When I was growing up, only 70% of the world had access to clean drinking water. Now that's 90%. Lifespans have doubled. In the United States, men can expect to live to almost 80 years old. I really appreciate this, by the way, because I'm 41 now. Okay, so I really appreciate that lifespans have doubled in this country. What about politics? 200 years ago, less than 1% of the world's population lived in democratic situations. Now that number is 2/3. Steven Pinker at Harvard has done voluminous research and has argued that we are actually, despite what you might see on your social media feed or in the nightly news, we are actually living through the most peaceful time in the history of our species. Time magazine has even gotten into it. One of the most extraordinary statistics I read was that the average American today has a higher quality of life than the richest man, John D. Rockefeller, had 100 years ago. So we Americans have this unique ability to bemoan our lives as we sit in air-conditioned houses, watching flat-screen TVs, doing research on our smartphones that have more power than the computers that got us to the moon. Now, why does this bother me so much? Because the young people sitting in our rooms, in my classroom every day, despite how wonderful and smart they are, generally have no idea how they became the luckiest human beings in history. In fact, I thought I was alone in this frustration until last year. I picked up a book by the most famous historian in America, David McCullough. And David McCullough tells of traveling around the country, talking to young people, and as he traveled more and more, he got more and more frustrated. As he says, the laws we live by, the freedoms we enjoy, the institutions that we take for granted, and we should never take for granted, are all the work of others who went before us. And to be indifferent to that isn't just to be ignorant, it's to be rude, not to understand what gave us the extraordinary opportunities we have. Now, I don't get to travel around the world on a jet like David McCullough. I don't sell hundreds of thousands of books, I'm sad to say. But I want to tell you what moment came to me where I have made the same realization that our young people don't quite understand how lucky they are. I want to tell you about the first activity I do every year. On the first day of school, or the first day of class at CSUB, I project a series of images onto the front to find out if the students know who these people are. Right? So let's play along, shall we? I start with what I call the low-hanging fruit. You can interpret that however you want. But typically, 100% of young people know Kim Kardashian West. Mother of Northwest. Okay? Everybody knows her. But then, I put this up as a second picture. I know you all know it, congratulations. Typically, only about 10% of my students can identify Mike Pence. About 10%. Now, then I want to make them feel good again, so I put up a picture of Beyonce, so they know who that is, of course. But then, I put this picture up. Now, his chief of staff is sitting right over there, and she's a former student of mine, so I actually changed my slide when I found out she was going to be here. Lord, you don't want to know. You don't even want to know how many people know the wonderful Vince Fong. Then, of course, I put this up, and the students say, well, is that you, Mr. Adams, from 10 years ago? I tell them yes, before I started feeding my brain so much food, right? But then, of course, what really saddens me, since I love the Supreme Court, is nobody can ever identify the Chief Justice or the most important judge in America, Anthony Kennedy. Now, this really came to a head in my life 3 years ago on what was probably the greatest night of my life, minus the birth of my children. You see, 3 years ago, Congressman Kevin McCarthy invited me to be his guest at the 2015 State of the Union. Now, that's the president in the bottom. I don't know if you know that. And then the red arrow is me. So I don't know if you could, just so you think I'm not making this up. Now, I'll get to why this was such a magical moment for me in a minute. I will tell you, though, despite the magical moment that I had here, and it was a lot of magical moments, the night did have its bumps, I have to be honest. I did get to go meet John Lewis, civil rights icon. I remember Congressman McCarthy had a friend. He said, this is my friend from Northern California. It was this woman I'd never seen before. We walk over, we meet John Lewis, and I'm kind of nervous, right, meeting a civil rights icon. And so I give this woman my phone, and I say, here's my iPhone, here's how you use it. She's like, well, I know how to use the iPhone. And so she takes a picture. A few minutes later, I take another picture, and I stupidly tell her again, here's how you use my phone. She goes, I know how to use it. We finish with the meet and greet. We go back to Congressman McCarthy's office. She leaves. The congressman walks up to me immediately and says, Jeremy, do you know who that woman was you kept telling how to use the iPhone? I said, no, who was that? He says, Steve Jobs' widow. What happened to transparent government, Kevin? Would have been nice to know that. Now, I wish I could tell you that things got a lot better. You have to understand, you take almost everything I love to teach, the institutions of American government, the Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court. It was all there that evening. And when President Obama comes in, I lost it a little bit. Okay, I'm clapping, I'm bouncing. I'm probably going to break this, but I'm bouncing. I'm so excited. The lady next to me says, you are really excited. And I said, I'm overjoyed. So the president comes up to the podium, right? He waves to Michelle. He waves it to the center, and then he comes, and we make eye contact, and I am so over the top, out of control, he laughs at me. Now, if you don't believe me, I actually have video. Would you play the video of this? Watch. Oh, I got to go to the right slide here. Michelle, middle. Ah, right there. Right there. That's the president laughing at me. Now we live, my friends, in a cynical time, in an era that loves to constantly belittle, bicker, and insult. And yet on this night, I have to tell you, I was overcome with a mighty emotion that was more than simple inspiration, more than patriotism, more than the titillation of standing a few feet from the president, the Congress, and the entire Supreme Court. As I stood in the galleys of the United States House of Representatives, I have to tell you that I realized that I was standing in the stream of history itself. And not just any history. You see, I have visited historical places before, my friends. I have been to the courts of kings and the palaces of czars. I'm talking about something more substantial. On this night, this civics teacher was gazing at institutions whose task it is to preserve the most important aspiration in human history, the hope of universal human justice. It was our Congress that has proposed all 27 amendments that I teach. It is our president who has waged countless wars to keep the republic together. It is our Supreme Court who makes sure that our Constitution is more than just a piece of parchment, that our policies should never veer too far from our principles. On this night, it's true, I gazed in wonderment, and yet, I was a little bit saddened. You see, I wanted to take this magnificent moment and I wanted to bottle it up so that I could pour it over my students on the first day of class. You see, for so many of our young people, the magical melody of America is not a consonant song of infinite potential, but instead is a discordant history of unfulfilled promises and empty oratory. For them, there is no reason to bathe in these waters, no history worth knowing, no inspiration to be had. Of course, what they do not understand is that they did not become the luckiest human beings in history on accident. They are the healthiest, wealthiest, freest, most interconnected creatures on the history of the planet. My fear, and what I'm trying to communicate to all of you today, is this: the values, the institutions, and the behaviors that deliver these opportunities to our young people are not immune from decay. The famous historian Daniel Borstein once said, "Trying to plan for the future without knowing the past is like trying to plant cut flowers." And yet that is exactly what we are doing to an entire generation of young people who have no idea how they became as fortunate as they are. I can't explain to you how difficult it is to explain to them the people, the ideas, the triumphs, and the failures that came before them. So there are a few things all of us in this room need to do to prevent this and to improve things. First of all, let us stop assuming that history is inevitable. It's not. In fact, when you think about it, so many things in history could have gone differently. If the Greeks lose to the Persians at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, then democracy and science lose out to superstition and monarchy before they ever take root. What happens if Abraham Lincoln wins his senatorial election against Stephen Douglas in 1858? Did you know that in 1940, in FDR's third inaugural speech, I'll step out for a minute of my speech and just be a teacher. This is the most underappreciated inaugural speech, by the way. FDR's third, look it up. Back to my speech. In his third inaugural speech, he had to remind the world that while fascism was ascendant, it would never triumph over liberal democracy as long as we were willing to work for it. And what we really forget is how young the founding fathers were. We forget how much this country is an act of extemporaneous belief and action. If you forget that, by the way, look at the back of the $1 bill. It says, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. Thomas Jefferson was only 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Hamilton was only 30. Neither of them were George Washington's first choices to be in the cabinet. He wanted John Jay to be Secretary of State, and he wanted Robert Morris to be Secretary of Treasury. The second thing we must do is we must push back, and I mean push back hard as a country and a community, against the chic and fashionable idea that the forces of history and society always overwhelm the might and the inspiration of the individual. The most powerful idea in all of human history is a uniquely American idea. And that idea is that every man and woman, regardless of the circumstance of their birth, regardless of race, class, gender, or sexual orientation, is free of heart and mind, free to act, speak, and believe in accordance with one's inner convictions. We Americans are not subjects of a king. We are not mandatory members of an established church. We are not pawns of a feudal order that dictate how our lives will turn out before they've even begun. So yes, it is true. This is our creed as Americans. This is our civic religion. This is what Lincoln called the proposition of America. And it absolutely, positively is the exception to the rule of human history. Bondage, not liberty, is the rule. Poverty, not prosperity, has been the lot of mankind for thousands of years. Due process has far less prominence in the pages of history books than the writ of a king or the whim of a pharaoh. History is the story of Caesars and Kaisers and lords and pharaohs and warrior chiefs and kings and queens. So yes, for most of human history, the force of history did overwhelm the dreams and the aspirations of the individual, but not in America. You see, every year I meet hundreds of young Americans who know that they have individual liberty, but what they don't always have is individual belief. We must teach them that America is more than a place, more than an economy, more than a constitution. America is a spirit, and it's not natural. It has to be taught. It has to be cultivated. It has to be endlessly encouraged. Which brings me to the third and final thing we must do. I'm going to be honest. I hesitated before accepting this invitation this morning. I mean, think about it. Let's be honest. Who doesn't belong in this lineup? I don't have a PhD in economics. I don't have a PhD in finance. I'm not an entrepreneur. I don't run a business. I'm a public employee. You give me a check, I'll turn it over, sign it, and put it in my bank account. Right? That's what I would do. But the truth of the matter is, and I hate to admit this, the people sitting in this room have far more power and potential in sharing this spirit than I do. You are the entrepreneurs. You are the innovators. You are the creators, not me. Did you know that when Teddy Roosevelt was 22 years old, he was diagnosed with a heart condition, and he was told that he would have to live a very quiet and sedentary life? Well, being Teddy Roosevelt, he stood up, pointed at the doctor, and said, "Sir, I will do the exact opposite, even if it kills me when I'm young." Do you know why? Because that's not what Americans do. We are not critics. We are not observers. We go into the arena of life. We embrace the strenuous life. When we reach high. When we dream big. We don't hope, we aspire. And when we fail, which we all do, we don't claim victimhood as a reason for not trying anew. This is still the land where people in this country believe that hard work and self-belief gets you to where you want to be. 73% of Americans still believe this. Europeans don't. Our European friends, the average is 35%. Now, I love Europe, but I don't want to be European. If we allow our young people to believe that they don't have control of their lives, that they are victims of chance or pawns of history, then don't expect good things to continue. To conclude, I don't know what's going to inspire you to share this spirit with our young people. But I just want to end by telling you a story about what inspired me. It's a long time ago now, in college. Wish it wasn't that long ago, but it is. And I remember studying about the Second Continental Congress. And I remember reading that on June 7th, 1776, a man by the name of Richard Henry Lee stood up in the Second Continental Congress and said, "These states ought to be free and independent." That's the first time anybody had legally said so. For the next 3 weeks, the Second Continental Congress took part in this very rowdy debate, led by the Atlas of American Independence, John Adams, giving the greatest speech of his life on June 1st, 1776, and we all know what happened 3 days later. You know what I find awfully coincidental in my own life? On June 7, 1976, another J. Adams was born. Now, I know that I'm in a room full of sophisticated, educated people, and I know that sophisticated people today don't talk about words like fate and destiny and providence, but I believe that sharing the spirit of this country has always been my fate, my task. John Adams once said, I study politics and war so that my sons may study art and philosophy. Well, if this Jay Adams may disagree with that Jay Adams, we must never stop studying our politics and our principles. Because if we do, then don't expect America to be the exception to the rule of history for much longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Very inspiring, and you should definitely do a TED Talks. That would probably be more successful than a Richard Talks, and millions of more views. So, well, now we're going to get into the economist part of a portion of the day, and I'm really excited to introduce John Shin. I've seen him actually perform at Cafe Med, his presentation. And really, there are probably, I'll give you a heads up, about 60 to 70 slides, but really pay attention because I was really transfixed by them. And as you know, if you know me, that's pretty difficult, my attention span. But what you're going to hear is his global take, and what an impressive portfolio. If you see his CV. In terms of a Harvard PhD in economics, a undergrad at UCal, Berkeley, and this is the best part. His title is Senior G10 FX Strategist. How do I get that? So I did Google it. I used the Google, and I found out. I know what senior means. But G10, I know the economists in the audience know, that is the top 10 currencies in the world. And FX, not special effects, but FX, Forex, I believe, am I correct? I'm looking for, John. Forex, which is foreign exchange. Don't want to cut into your time. He is with Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and he created the flagship publication called World at a Glance. He's also, which was Jeremy's presentation ties into this because John is the postdoc research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. So how does that tie in? Where are the connections? Well, Kern County was rated #1 by the National Bureau of Economic Research for mobility. So if you were born in the bottom 20% of the population income, the odds of you moving to the top 20% are the highest here than anywhere in the country. 12.2% of folks are able to do that. So that is that American dream. So it's great to have this segue and also to introduce John to the stage.
Wow. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for having me in. I'm San Jose native, actually, so it's always great to be back to the state. That last speaker was an extraordinarily stirring and entertaining time, so, we'll be very much the opposite of that for now. Just because, it is a confusing time. There's kind of less to say, that's so declarative. We've seen, for the last year, and that's kind of why we always talk about the last election, the next election, the future election, because politics and elections really are driving the markets and are driving the policies that they're paying attention to. And it's kind of a mixed time right now, even though we have still, last I checked, single-party government in D.C. And in kind of a curious way, that's what markets were looking forward to at the beginning of last year. If only because we had endured so many years of gridlock, it seemed that nothing really could get done, even if there were points that both parties agreed upon. And of course, then we've had the last year of truly extraordinary tumult, nothing really kind of going the way we had originally expected. We'll just look at a couple of slides. Don't worry, I don't understand why we threatened you with all 60 or 70 slides, which do exist there. But we just kind of use the slides to kind of elaborate on the broad themes. You don't have to pay as much attention to the overall text, just kind of the broad shapes, because the main issue that markets are paying attention to is the economic fallout from the Tax Cuts and Jobs bill as it was initially titled, that was passed at the end of last year. And the timing itself is so peculiar, if only because, among Republicans, there's a lot there that they agreed upon, but of course they wound up going through the Affordable Care Act and, all of the day-by-day political intrigue out of the White House. Whereas when you see the ultimate bill, it kind of wound up being a lot different from the tax reform that was talked about at the beginning of last year. When we think about reform, we're really thinking about simplification, rationalization, broadening the tax base. But the bill that was passed at the end of last year, in a lot of ways, was kind of a throwback, old school, kind of deficit finance tax cut that, in some sense, is temporary for several years. They did things like cut the corporate tax rate permanently from 35% to 21%, but they also, of course, had some personal income tax cuts that will be sunsetting after 5 years or so. A lot of the provisions in the bill actually wind up sunsetting over time. So, when we talk about the effect on the economy, the natural place to start with is when we talk about things like the budget deficit, because we were so worried about the deficit for such a long time. If you happen to look at the chart, that shows the deficit as a share of the economy. And, we do that because, talking about the actual numbers, it's hard to put them into the right context. $660 billion, that's such a gigantic figure. But the U.S. economy is a $20 trillion economy. So roughly speaking, the deficit last year was around 3% the size of the U.S. Whereas what do we do after the bill was passed? We wound up looking for a much bigger deficit. We're looking for $800 billion for this year, $1 trillion for next year. $1 trillion deficits are likely kind of for the time being. So now we're talking about 4 or 5% the size of the economy, which really is starting to get to kind of a point where you do consider that as a little bit dangerous. And more importantly, that's what markets are starting to consider. And that's why you're finally starting to see interest rates move a lot higher. The Federal Reserve is likely to hike rates 3 times this year and probably 3 times next year. We think that the U.S. 10-year interest rate is going to move to 3.25% by the end of this year. So consequently, we think that the markets are reacting, to some extent of the deficit concerns that are out there. And what makes these types of deficits unusual is that they're taking place in a time when we expect stronger growth. What did we do after the bill was passed was that we pushed up our growth forecast for the next couple of years. We're looking for 3% growth for this year. And if you think about the U.S. since really the end of the tech boom since 2000, that's almost pretty much double the rate that we've seen in the past 15 to nearly 20 years. We look for a similar strong growth rate for next year as well. But what we always caution is that, the reason why we look for stronger growth over the next couple of years isn't because we're taking a stance on the politics or what's the proper role or proper size of government, but it's almost like in a mechanical sense. The idea that if you do things that increase the after-tax income of the typical household, then you're going to have higher consumer spending. And if you put in elements like the immediate depreciation of capital expenditure, then you're going to have higher investment. That's not really kind of a political stance or even like a forecast. It's almost more like mechanical accounting, shifting around of the numbers, so that you're going to hear kind of a lot of dissonance in the forecast out there, because for the next couple of years, things really should be on the more positive side. We're already in an economy that has close to full employment by our measure, and now we're putting all of these tax cuts and, effectively speaking, fiscal stimulus on that. And that's kind of why you've seen a lot of the upset in the market in a strange way for these first couple of months, because they're trying to balance out the short-term effect from the long-term effect. Because when you think about the short-term effect, it seems fairly positive. If folks are looking at the chart, what they're seeing there is, what do we do to our growth forecast after the bill was passed, not just for the first couple of years, but what each bar represents is for the next 10 years. And that's a very peculiar shape that we have there, because you can see we have a big positive outlook in the near term, because that's when we're having all the positive elements from the tax cuts bill. But then when you kind of go out into the future, you have a much more negative impact. On net, it's basically a push, just slightly negative to some extent. And the main reason for that really is kind of relies both in the legislation and also the economics. And remember that the legislation is that a lot of this bill winds up sunsetting after 4 or 5 years, going out to the 10-year horizon. So the very positive effects that we expect for these first couple of years, that's not particularly controversial, those are by legislation set to phase out once you go out 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So the legislation seems a little bit peculiar, but there's also, of course, the economics, which is now you are starting to finally see, and it's kind of tricky to say, but a normalization of the U.S. economy. And it's taken a long time. Who knew that a decade after the bankruptcy of Lehman, we'd still be talking about the fallout of the financial crisis? But only now are you starting to see interest rates move a little bit higher. And from our vantage point, we had been looking for both interest rates to move higher, but also for the dollar to move higher as well. And kind of the strange thing is that you've seen the dollar soften up for a lot of this year. But in our view, you will see the dollar eventually move a bit higher because of the effect that you're seeing on interest rates. I hope this doesn't make folks car sick if I just jump ahead a few slides here. But the main reason that we're thinking about is because when you look at that left-hand side chart there, what that shows is the unemployment rate in the U.S. going back to the 1950s. And you can see the huge spike that we've had in the past 10 years and then the decline. The unemployment rate down to nearly 4%. As a bank, we expect the unemployment rate to fall to 3%, roughly speaking, over the next couple of years. And you can see historically that's extraordinary. But what's really interesting is that right-hand side chart, something called the labor force participation rate. Because in the U.S., if you don't have a job, but you're not looking for one, you're not counted as unemployed. And there's a sense that maybe the decline in the unemployment rate isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Maybe we're not near full employment, because it's just people dropping out of the labor market. And then you look at the right-hand side chart, which shows the participation rate. It asks, do you have a job or are you looking for one? And you see both the way that it declined so sharply in the Great Recession, but also the way that it hasn't recovered so far. And there's a sense that maybe it's just the way that the data are collected, that the unemployment rate is so low. Maybe the economy is a lot weaker than we think, and we need this type of fiscal stimulus. But that right-hand side chart is a little tricky to interpret. I think that's why our intuition, kind of fails us a little bit, because, I think our gut level tells us that when the unemployment rate falls, that's probably because the economy is doing well. Just like I think our gut tells us that when the participation rate falls, that's because the economy is doing horribly. And the fact that it hasn't risen yet means that the economy is probably doing a lot worse than we think, and that this is the right time for that type of fiscal stimulus, for those types of tax cuts. But we worry a little bit about that because we don't think that's the right interpretation of people exiting the labor market. Because when you look at that right-hand side chart, you see the explosion in the participation rate in the 60s, in the 70s, going into the 1980s. And that really didn't have to do with economic policy. It's a lot about demographics, not about the Kennedy tax cuts or the LBJ guns and butter fiscal policy or whip inflation now buttons from President Ford or any other policy like that. It's really about changing, shifting social mores. And in this case, the most important element there, and I know there's a lot of charts there, but just notice the shape on the upper right-hand side chart, is women entering the labor force. What that upper right-hand side chart shows is female labor force participation for what economists call the prime age groups 25 to 34, 35 to 44, and 45 to 54. And you can see that goes back to the 1950s and the explosion that you had really starting in the 1960s over the next generation. And that didn't really have anything to do with Fed policy or economic issues necessarily in terms of macro policy, but because of new demographic changes. So what we always have to be kind of cautious with is thinking about the labor market. Is it really near full employment? And in our view, it actually closely is to that. There's been a lot of conversation about men dropping out of the labor force. That's what you see in the upper left-hand side chart there. That shows, again, going back to the 1950s, kind of what has happened to male labor force participation rates, again, for those three age groups. And you see kind of the same element in the past 10 years where you've had this big drop. But kind of this is why context is so important, because there's always this kind of insinuation that maybe the Great Recession had broken the U.S. economy in a way that we hadn't seen before. And that's why people are dropping out of the labor market. And you see men dropping out of the labor market, and it only kind of enhances that view. But if you look at that upper left-hand side chart, what you see is that men have been dropping out of the labor market, not just in the past 10 years, but in the past 50, 60 years. And I mean, that doesn't make it any better, but really what it does is to put the right context into it. That, to some extent, I think we associate a higher labor force participation rate as automatically a good thing, and a lower one is necessarily being kind of a bad thing. But that's exactly why you have to kind of put this thinking, into the right shape. Maybe 97% of men being in the labor market, back in the 1950s potentially might have been on the higher side. So, ultimately, demographics are a key thing in terms of thinking about the fullness of the labor market. And the most important demographic shift that we've had really in the past 15 or 20 years, has been the aging of the population. It's really, in an accounting sense, the main reason why the participation rate has fallen so much. When you look at that left-hand side chart, what that left-hand side chart shows is the share of the population, that's 16 to 24, 25 to 54, and 55 and over. So at every single point in time, the three lines add up to one, a complete mutually exclusive accounting of the population. And you can see that middle line, the share of 55-year-olds and over has gone up dramatically in the past decade, and it's likely to keep going in that direction. That's really just a lot of demographic destiny that's in place right now. So why is that important? It's important because of the right-hand side chart. Because the right-hand side chart shows you the labor force participation rate for these different age groups. If you're 25 to 54, you're in the labor market 80% of the time. If you're 55 and over, you're in the labor market around 40% of the time. And again, this kind of gets back to what is, quote, the right labor force participation rate. Because generally we think, that the lower participation rate for older workers probably makes more sense. The U.S. has collected this data for a long time, even if you go back, to the 19th century, to the pre-Civil War. Right now, our president is a man who's 65 to 74 years old, and if you look at the data right now, men 65 to 74 are in the labor market around 30% of the time. Whereas if you go back, 100, 150 years back to 1870, men were in the labor market who were 65 to 74 around 90% of the time. So, was that a good thing or not? Probably not, in our view, because the main reason for that was just because there's no such thing as retirement, back in the 1870s, right? You just pretty much worked until you died for those group of people who managed to reach 65 to 74. We think that lower rates for older people probably make a lot more sense. But what that also means is that over the years, we're likely to see the participation rate continue to fall. So the reason why we talk about this is because what it means is that the 4% unemployment rate really means 4%, that the unemployment rate really is historically low in our view. And so by pouring all of the stimulus onto the economy, what markets are really worried about is that at a time when the Federal Reserve is now raising interest rates, no longer doing the type of quantitative easing that really kind of put it in the political, kind of turmoil, and at the same time that you're probably going to have a real private demand for capital, it seems strange that, we're doing this at a time when the economy seems to be doing relatively well, certainly as measured by the overall labor market. But that's great that, folks like me or policymakers in the markets think that, we're near full employment. But generally, when I think about full employment, I would think that, workers are elated, have tons of job offers. And, it's interesting, when we talk to the bank's clients, we know, and when we also read from the anecdotal evidence from the Federal Reserve's Beige Book, that, employers are finding it more and more difficult to find qualified workers for the vacancies that they have in the labor market. But so far, at least in the data that we have, we just really haven't had that type of evidence. You look at wage growth, and we have two measures of wage growth right there. The left-hand side chart shows the average hourly earnings growth in the U.S. going back to before the crisis, and you really see kind of halting, fitfully starting evidence. But wages really haven't gone, in an accelerating fashion, such that so many workers are still genuinely, disappointed with the labor market. If you look at the right-hand side chart, which shows something called the Employment Cost Index, which also controls for salaried workers, controls for their benefits, also has things, where, they're really kind of having a consistent measure of wages over time. It tells you kind of the same story. And I think to some extent, this really explains, why there's so much antipathy towards things like international trade. Because despite the fact that by some measures we're in our full employment, workers really haven't really been able to enjoy the fruits of that. Instead, what they wind up having are things like automation, international trade that seems to both threaten their jobs. And you really can't do that much about automation. You can't really fight the machine, to try to save your job for only so long. And that's why we've had kind of these outbursts when it comes to increasing tariffs, to the extent that it seems like at least some way, at least temporarily, that we can wind up protecting jobs, even if it's not on a permanent basis. But we do think, on a more optimistic side, that you will see wage growth. It's been such a long wait. I think that it's the biggest macro puzzle really over the past year, if only because, we've really kind of seen, inflation really be on the lower side in the aggregate in the U.S. What the left-hand side chart shows is inflation running at around 2%, for the past 15 years with a lot of volatility. But it's one of the reasons why the Fed was so aggressive at the start of the crisis in terms of doing quantitative easing, moving to emergency measures, because they didn't want the U.S. to fall into a deflationary trap. Several years ago when Greece was having the crises, there was a lot of conversation about whether or not the U.S. could become like Greece. And, in our view, that wasn't really kind of a likely scenario. Always remember that the U.S. is issuing its debt in its own currency, and that makes a huge difference in terms of the sustainability of that debt relative to what investors will be willing to take on. The more likely risk at the time was that the U.S. becomes a place like Japan, which has been in a deflationary twilight for the past 20, 25 years, where you have economic stagnation and a generation where they see really no hopes in terms of a higher aspiration, higher standards of living for them. Unfortunately, we think that the U.S. has managed to avoid that. But now, kind of in a strange way, we're finally starting to see kind of the relative downside to that, which is when you look at kind of where interest rates are moving. And what the left-hand side chart shows is just the 10-year interest rate generally on top and the 2-year interest rate generally on bottom. And that chart goes back to the late 1990s. And you can see kind of at the very end, both of them are moving higher along with our view, if only because you're starting to see now that normalization of the economy. You hear some chatter about, well, maybe that's a bad sign, because usually the difference between those two lines is seen as an indicator for recession. If you look at the right-hand side chart, the bars, that's what you see there. And you see kind of the way that things went negative in 2000, right ahead of the 2001 recession, or the way things went negative ahead of the Great Recession going into 2007 and into 2008. So to the extent that the lines have been moving lower over the past couple of years, we're not as worried about that. We think that recession is still considerably far ways off, even though the U.S. has been in recovery for quite a long time now. It's still not quite the longest recovery in the NBR's official recession dating history. The NBR is the official arbiter of such times. But for the next couple of years, it seems like a recession is just that much more unlikely because we're going to be enjoying kind of the benefits of all of that fiscal stimulus. But that's kind of the mixed picture that we have. For these first couple of years, it is likely to be pretty positive. But then what happens in those years after that? If you do wind up falling into recession, what type of fiscal stimulus will we be able to put down then, given that we've gone through so much of it now? Kind of especially to the extent that the Federal Reserve is hiking rates, they're doing so in anticipation of trying to get things back to normal as fast as possible. And we've kind of seen the markets react to that, both in equities, where we're still pretty positive, as well as interest rates and foreign exchange. So we just kind of want to warn about concerns in those out years, but for these first couple of years, we're pretty optimistic for the U.S. Let me just stop there as my time is up. So thanks very much, everyone, for taking the time. Thanks.
Thank you, John. That was incredibly enlightening. I'm glad we didn't have to go through all 70 slides in the deck, though. We're going to continue our role of economists. Our next presenter is on the faculty at CSUB. He is an expert in health and labor economics, and I know that may make some of your eyes glaze over, but he's actually a very funny person. He may drop a four-letter word or two during his presentation. No, not this year? Not this year? Okay. Dr. Richard Gerhardt, Associate Professor of Economics from CSUB. Please welcome him.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I was told to speak very loudly. Usually I don't need a microphone. I kind of yell all the time. So unlike my esteemed previous colleague, I don't come from a prestigious academic institution. My academic institution is mainly known for national caliber football teams. So, hey, we're just good. So what I want to talk about is I want to talk about healthcare, and I want to talk about labor markets, because I think those are trends and those are forecasts that are incredibly important for Kern County. And I first want to focus on healthcare. And so every year, the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation creates something known as county health rankings, where they rank all the counties in California according to different either outcomes, so life expectancy, or different healthcare inputs. And so, as we kind of all expect, out of the 57 counties with data, Kern County doesn't look as good as it should. So we are 46th in length of life, 54th in quality of life, 57th in health behaviors, that's not necessarily a good thing, 52nd in healthcare resources, 51st in socioeconomics, and 52nd in environmental quality, those sorts of things. But they miss a big picture. Again, perhaps the issues we see with health outcomes, so maybe diabetes or length of life or quality of life, are maybe related to the demographics and the unique challenges that our healthcare providers face on a daily basis. And so I want to just show some data. If you look at household healthcare costs, Kern County residents spend about $7,000 more per year than a California household, with about $7,000 less of household income. So we spend more even though we're earning less. About 1/3 of adults in Kern County are considered obese. 1 in 5 adults don't actively monitor their diabetes, which means you don't take care of it every day. That's not good. And then about 1 in 4 individuals don't engage in any physical activity during their leisure time. That's counted as 15 minutes of walking per day. That's bad. So there are some issues, can't deny it. But should we penalize a healthcare system for factors that might be outside of their control? If you ask any healthcare provider, my wife is one and I ask her all the time, probably annoy her too much, the hardest thing they face is changing people's behaviors or facing unique socioeconomic issues. Try getting your 2-year-old to change their diet. Try getting a millennial to change their sleeping patterns. Those are all huge issues. So what I want to focus on is I want to focus on how these sort of common sense healthcare rankings miss a huge opportunity and how we're actually not that bad. Actually, our healthcare providers, our healthcare institutions, everyone we see is actually doing quite a good job with what we face. They're facing an uphill battle every time they go to work. And so healthcare efficiency is how our healthcare resources, so the providers, the treatments, the facilities, the spendings, are turned into good health outcomes. And this is all from a paper that Dr. Machek and I are writing that's been conditionally accepted. If I don't screw it up, I probably will. And so pen and paper, so these are the equations utilized. So if you want to start working out if this math is right, and then you do some computer coding, that's the only way I could get it fixed. Or better yet, just treat it as magic. That's the best way to treat what I've been doing, just magic. And so what I want to do is I want to see how outside variables, obesity, household income, smoking, the unemployment rate, child poverty rates, impact healthcare efficiency. I want to see how our common measures are influenced by these other factors that we know matter. I want to take into account behavior, the demographics, the healthcare resources, and the socioeconomics that providers face on a daily basis, because we all know the number one thing that a patient does right after a doctor's visit is ignores the doctor's advice. And so once we actually take into account these factors, we're actually doing a fantastic job at providing health care to our population. And so basically what you should take from all of these numbers are that it appears that life expectancy is 3 years too short in Kern County. So everyone should be living 3 years more on average, into their 80s. Well, once you take into account behavior, demographics, healthcare resources, the socioeconomics, that explains away all of the inefficiency, all of the ineffectiveness of our healthcare delivery system. Or, given our healthcare resources in Kern County, if we had any one of the following, demographics, socioeconomics, or behaviors like those of Santa Barbara, men in Kern County would live 2 years longer on average. Women would live a little under 2 years longer on average. They would live into their 80s. Men would live close to 80. Not precisely, but close. And so what matters? What is negatively impacting how our healthcare providers are treating patients? Obesity. Obviously, we want less obesity. That matters. Actively monitoring diabetes. We want more people actively monitoring their diabetes. It's an easy treatment if you monitor it. We want more people actively engaging in mammograms. That one's a little bit questionable, just from the fact that I know there's lots of dispute about the age ranges with which you should get mammograms, but we typically think that people that do engage in mammograms probably go see their doctors much more often than your typical male, which is none. I mean, my wife's a healthcare provider. I haven't been to a doctor in 5 years. So that speaks of the issues that we face. In terms of demographics, we want fewer elderly. You know, before people get angry at me, I'm going to get millennials in a little bit, and I'm a millennial, so I have to get rid of myself. Socioeconomics, we want higher household income, we want less unemployment. And so we have all these fancy little graphs, but it's not the institutions in Kern County that matters. What matters is the fact that our healthcare providers are providing excellent care, but people aren't either following through, or we have unique challenges that need to be addressed. So what can we do? So we can reduce the cost of diabetes monitoring. It's not that high, but we can reduce that. We might want to incentivize healthy workplaces, midday walking facilities. I know a number of facilities out in the northern part of Kern County have tracks where people can go walk at lunchtime. That's a fantastic idea. Maybe provide wearable exercise trackers. That's a little bit worrisome. The one thing that people are bad at is that people actually underestimate the number of calories they're consuming by about 300 calories per day. So you sit there and you go, hey, I'm eating a Big Mac, it's only 200 calories. Probably not a good thing. So we see that these small micro-level policies can actually have huge impacts. So again, why should we care? Well, this report just came out. The millennials ages 17 to 35 will be the most obese cohort in history. That's not good. Well, and that's also not necessarily a bad thing. As Jeremy pointed out, you know, they have access to a lot of things. Part of it is caloric consumption. 70, 80 years ago, it was subsistence agriculture where you might starve. Nowadays, you don't have that. But there's nearly a 90% correlation between the obesity rate and healthcare costs. And so, forecasting out, if current trends continue, about half of Kern County residents will be obese by 2050. And if that's bad, that's about $400 million more spent in healthcare that we could be spending elsewhere. So we have to tackle the problem now. Again, people's behaviors. So we recognize that we have challenges, but recognizing challenges early is important. So healthcare. Not necessarily the heartwarming story, but now I want to talk about wage trends. This is the good part of the story. Unemployment in Bakersfield, or Kern County as a whole, is hitting lows not seen in over a decade. The unemployment rate in Mojave is 13.1%, Bakersfield City itself under 7%, Tehachapi under 6%, Arvin 9.1%, California City 16.4%, Fraser Park 6.6%. These are lows not seen in a decade. That's phenomenal. Nationally, we're reaching our natural rate of unemployment. So remember your principles of macroeconomics class. I was going to give you a quiz on this, but then I realized you guys rated me in the booklet, and based on how students respond to quizzes, I decided not to. So here's the answer. The natural rate of unemployment basically means we just have people either looking for jobs, in between jobs, or they lost their jobs because of technology. It's not because of the economy or recession. And we're actually reaching our natural rate of employment here in Kern County. And so what does reaching our natural rate of unemployment mean in Kern County? Well, if unemployment is high, businesses have all the market power. They can basically offer wages, and if I'm unemployed, I'll want to take the job. There's a large pool of laborers willing to work. When unemployment is low, a lot more of the bargaining power shifts to the individual workers themselves. What we tend to see is that businesses either have to poach workers from other firms, they do that by offering better wages, better benefits, or they have to poach workers out of the labor force. Again, if I'm not working and you have to induce me to work, you have to pay me a pretty good salary. So we should start to see some upward wage pressures. One limitation, and this is something that we all make a mistake about, is that wages aren't income. The wages I'm paid is not the value of my work. Income are the wages I'm paid plus non-wage benefits. And so, other than males, most males, at least most millennial males, people value health insurance benefits. About $1 of health insurance benefits is worth $1 of wages. Again, except for millennial males who don't value health insurance at all. And so what have we seen? Well, we have wages from 2002 to 2017. So since 2002, accountants have seen an average salary increase of $7 per hour. Construction or extraction supervisors have seen a $6 increase. Farm supervisors, a $6 increase. Nurses, largely because of nursing shortages in this area, have seen a nearly $15 increase. That's phenomenal. And overall wages have increased by only $4 in the past 16 years. That's very low. And what this means is that basically your average family is earning a little over $50,000 per year. Enough to live on, but certainly we want something more. So wages actually track very closely with labor supply and labor demand. As much as we like to think it, and as much as it is true for certain occupations, a lot of wages aren't tied to water availability, ag prices, oil prices, those sorts of things. That's important. We're starting to diversify. And so here's my forecast. A very optimistic forecast, but I think it's pretty important. For 2017 up till 2022, nurses will see a 16% increase in their wages in just 5 years. $7, which is about half of what they saw in 16 years. That's phenomenal. Construction and extraction supervisors will see about a 12% increase in their overall wages, and everyone should see about 11% higher wages by 2022. Now, $1 or so increase in wages, that doesn't seem like a lot. It translates to about $6,000 more per family. That's significant. Why is it significant? $6,000 more is significant. Why? Well, the average household had about $16,000 in credit card debt. So that's average credit card debt. There's families with a lot more. The average household spends about $12,000 per year on groceries. And optimistically, with this extra $6,000, you could afford $25,000 more in housing. That's phenomenal. So what I see for the next 5 years is tremendous upward wage pressures. And I think those will be highly important and highly effective. So thank you, and I now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Macheka, after. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Since we're both Richards, his middle name is Schuyler, so feel free to refer to him as Schuyler in the future. And thank you, Richard, for not wearing your pink pants and sandals and paisley shirt. We're both from the South, but our attire differs. And I'm excited now to introduce, do I call you Dr. Nkunde Macheka? Well, Nkunde, and actually both Richard and Nkunde came here in 2014. An amazing job in 3 years how they've acclimated to Kern County and really helping tell the story. And actually, Nkunde came from, previously was in West Virginia, so I guess we're all from the South. His PhD was in natural resources and environmental economies. And interesting, he's in West Virginia, and his thesis was on coal distribution in China. So you would think you would do the West Virginia coal distribution thesis, but I'm sure it was highly acclaimed, and you still receive likes on Facebook. But without further ado, I'll have Nkunde Macheka, nicknamed Nakes, or Mitch, come to the stage, please.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so happy to see you all here. It's amazing how a year can go so fast. I mean, a year ago, we're sitting here talking about oil prices and employment, but today we talk a little bit about a few different things. So just to give you a heads up on what we'll talk about. Oh, wait, I went back. I gotta go forward. So the first thing I'll do is my presentation is in 3 parts. I'll first talk about the demographics in Kern County. Next, I'll talk about current economic trends, and I'll talk about a research paper that we've been talking about over the years that we've been presenting at economic conferences, and it touches on Kern County, very interesting topic, has received a lot of feedback and is currently under review. So that'll be the second topic I'll talk about. And then the third thing is I'll look at current trends nationwide. There are a lot of things that are happening across the country. So there'll be a few graphs here and there, but I just hope that you guys take at least one thing home, okay? Just pick whatever you want, just go home at least, and you'll have a story to tell. So the first slide, as always, is we talk a little bit about demographics. We talk about population, and one thing you'll notice is that our population is still, we're still a little bit over below 900,000 people, but our population has been growing faster than the previous years. In 2015-16, we grew 0.64. 16-17, we grew 1.2%, which was higher than California and higher in the nation, growing quite fast. Population-wise, gender is about 51%, and then at the end, you'll see a graph that shows you composition in terms of Hispanic, white, black. And one thing you'll notice is that 52% of the population is Hispanic. If you take 100 people, maybe this group right here, at least 50% of them will be Hispanic, and 34% will be white, and 6% will be black. Now, if you flip the story, if this was now California, this was Kern. If this was California, the numbers change a little bit. The percentage of Hispanic and white is about 38%, split evenly. And then the population of Asian is about 3 times the number in Bakersfield. So it's 5.2 in Kern County, but 15% in California. Unemployment, how are we doing in terms of unemployment? That's a good graph. That graph looks good because it's going down. That's a good thing, right? Unemployment rate is going down, and it's at 9.3% as of January. Still not the lowest we've ever had. The lowest we've had in Kern County is about 7.5, which was in 2006. So in terms of unemployment rate, we're going, unemployment is going down, and then the median age is 31.3, which means half the population is over 31 years, and the other half is below 31 years. And the graph right next to it shows the same, right? 48% of the population in Kern County is below the age of 29. So let's talk a little bit about our research project. Very interesting topic here. And I'll throw in some numbers, and then I'll let you guys think a little bit about this. So the 2 graphs there show us oil production in Kern County. As of 2016, Kern County produced 144 million barrels of oil. The next largest county was Los Angeles, which was 24 million barrels. And with 144, that means, that number translates to 75% of the oil we produce in California. That's a lot. That's a lot, ladies and gentlemen. So we produce all this oil, but let's look at some other things like poverty rates and education attainment. Two figures there. The figure on the left shows poverty rates, and the darker it is, the higher the poverty rate. And one thing you'll notice is that right in the center, right in the Central Valley, there's a cluster of darker counties. So the poverty rate in Kern County is a little bit higher, right? Kern County and a few other surrounding counties is a little bit higher. And then the graph on the right shows education attainment, and you'll see that the lighter it is, the less the education attainment or the graduation rate. So that's an interesting thing that's happening. Here we have high production of oil, high production of these natural resources, but then if you look at our education attainment and poverty rates, it's a bit inverse. Which brings us to the issue or a topic that we call the resource curse, right? We tend to ask questions like the resource curse. When people hear resource curse, they're like, oh my God, is that a curse? Curse? The resource curse is a phenomenon where natural resources, abundance of natural resources, tend to impede economic growth in countries. Ladies and gentlemen, this is something that's happened across the world, right? And when we talk about natural resources, we're talking about minerals, we're talking about materials, we're talking about forests, we're talking about fertile land, water, right? So the more abundant you have in terms of natural resources, then economic growth tends to have an inverse relationship in terms of growth. And that's a widely studied topic. So how does that actually happen? It's not that you have a lot of natural resources, then all of a sudden economic growth is affected. There are transmission channels in between. Abundance of natural resources, which are meant to probably go into the economy, collect, the government collects taxes and invest that in infrastructure, or high income. If people have high income levels, then they can invest in education and healthcare and all these other things. But those things tend not to happen. And why? Because we have 7 things which we call transmission channels through which the resource curse occurs. Those transmission channels are the ones that I have shown there. So on the left side, you'll see resource abundance. Then you have the transmission channels, and then at the end, you have the resource curse. So when people do research, if they pick a country, for example, if they decide to pick Nigeria, or if they decide to pick Saudi Arabia, or Angola, or they decide to pick the Appalachian region, which produces a lot of coal, then you would be studying one of those things. It actually started with the Dutch disease, Netherlands. So things like the Dutch disease, volatile commodity prices, economic mismanagement, institutions, corruption, and then last at the bottom you have neglect of education, and that one is red. Okay? So by studying one of those areas and studying how that affects the economic development of a country, then you can study whether the resource curse has occurred or not. Now, people will say, well, that doesn't really happen, or maybe, where does this actually happen? So I put a map here, and that shows all the countries, not all of them actually. I couldn't fit them there. And don't try and spend time trying to see where those arrows are going, because this graph was a little bit tricky to put together. But all I'm saying is that those are countries which have been suspected or have gone through the resource curse and done away with it, or are still trying to work their way through it. The countries in blue show countries that have actually evaded the resource curse. The ones in white are the ones under study. And then you'll see Kern County, the yellow little blob there, right? And the funny thing is, every time we go to conferences and we talk about this, people ask, how come you guys have never talked about Kern County? There's a paucity of studies. There are not very many studies that look at Kern County. Appalachia has received a lot of attention, right? Produced a lot of coal. Alberta, up in the north. So we decided, you know what, let's focus on this county and let's see what's going on. Now, it's just one county, but let's investigate this, and let's actually see whether education is affected by abundance of resources. So we decided to look, let's see who else has worked on this, or let's see what other studies have worked on this. And you'll find that this is something that has been done by many, many scholars. The first study that was done within 86 countries found that school enrollment was inversely related to abundance of natural resources. Then you have a study by Black et al., which was looking at the Appalachian region, and these guys looked at this study since the 70s. You'll notice that high school dropouts in the 70s in Appalachia earned more than high school graduates. So the dropout rates at the time in Appalachia, now Appalachia has 420 counties, so that's a big stretch of land, from New York all the way down to Tennessee. Found that a lot of people, high school dropout rates were higher. In Alberta, we have the same story. Texas was also very interesting. A couple of folks said and looked at the advent of fracking, hydraulic fracking, which has been taking part in the Marcellus Shale region, which is in the eastern part of the country, has experienced a lot of dropout rates. In fact, they say resource booms reduced completion rates. In Texas, the story was a little bit interesting. The oil industry actually pulled some students out of class, but then reinvested some money into the education. So they had really good schools, high quality education, high quality teachers, but the dropout rates were quite a little bit higher. So we decided, okay, you know what, let's do this. Let's test this and look at a few things. Now, what we decided was we're going to look at Kern County and we're going to compare what's happening in Kern County with Fresno, Santa Barbara, Ventura. Let's look at all these oil producing counties, and also let's talk about ag. Because when you talk about resources, agriculture is one of them and oil is also another one. So we did that. That graph right there shows you the relationship between oil production and on the y-axis you have poverty. What you want to see, Kern County you'll notice is out there. We produce a lot of oil, but that dot should be at the bottom. Our poverty rates should be at the bottom in comparison to the other counties that we have on the graph. Then we said, let's look at agriculture. Same type of situation, but we're out there with Fresno. So we said, okay, you know what, this is probably something we should study, and our main objective, do past and present values of resource abundance help explain education attainment at the college level in Kern County and 5 other counties, okay? So just to cut the whole, I didn't put any econometrics here, no time series models, we just went straight to the results, and we found that at least through the education channel, or through the education transmission channel, there's no evidence of the resource curse in Kern County. Okay, so there was no evidence. In other counties, we found that, you know, there could be some relationship between 5 or 3 years ago of resource abundance and on education. So having said that, we said, okay, you know what, we're lucky. We have oil, we have ag in Kern County. We need to diversify. We need to think a little bit outside the box, and let's see what industries we can think of. So I put a slide together here and said, let's look at employment trends in Kern County and employment trends in California, and let's see which sectors have gained the most jobs. Kern County, in terms of employment, you'll see that the clothing industries gained close to 2,000 jobs. The change is 95%. The state and government education teachers went up. City education as well, you can see that they employed more. But California's story is quite interesting. Look at California. Vehicle manufacturing went from 4,600 to 15,200. That's 230% change. Why do you guys think that happened? You can whisper that to your friend. It starts with T and ends with SLA, Tesla, right? Tesla. Look at data processing and hosting services. All these things, the number of cars, the number of people working in this industry has shot up, gone up. And although it has gone up, it's not as high, or it's not higher than what's going on in Detroit. So another interesting statistic came to mind. Employment in breweries increased by 135% between 2010 and 2016. That's a statistic that was put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Big number. In fact, they said that breweries accounted for half the jobs gained in the beverage and manufacturing industry. Now, just to ask you guys, when you think of Napa, when you think of Sonoma, when you think of Paso Robles, what comes to mind? Right? And your taste buds start tingling. Tingly, 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 right? That's something. Now, when you think of San Diego, when you think of Denver, when you think of San Jose, what comes to mind? I don't say it too loudly, because I asked a couple of people and they're like, oh, the marijuana industry. I said, no. Those cities are the cities which have the largest number of breweries in the country. Look at this. Let's talk about breweries for a while. The number of craft breweries in 2016 was up. We had about 6,000 breweries. In 1985, we only had 37 breweries in the country. Now we have 6,000. Ladies and gentlemen, California leads. We have about 623 breweries in California, and San Diego alone has 250 breweries. That's a large number. People travel to go see these things, right? The economic impact is also very large. In California, the economic $7.4 billion is what the craft brewing industry contributes to the economy. And nationwide, we're talking about $67 billion. Now, this is something that's happened over a very short time, right? Let's look at something else. Let's look at employment. The employment numbers also went up. You can see we started off at 25,000 just about 4 or 5 years ago, and now we're at 58,000. Big thing. Craft breweries I called the CBC office in Kern County a few days ago. They said in Kern County we have 13 breweries, but in Bakersfield we have 5. Okay? Now, these are things which are changing. They're growing. They're growing. And in terms of employment, California also leads in employment. California and Colorado. Those are 2 big areas where we have a lot of employment related to breweries. Now, let me ask you, ladies and gentlemen, a question. Who do you think is driving this industry? Millennials. Hey, yeah, someone said that millennials. There's 75 million millennials. 75 million millennials in the country. Amanda, 75. Everyone seems to be picking on you. She's texting, but 75 million millennials drive this. Look at this. Millennials, let me tell you one thing about millennials. Millennials are confident, they're open to change, they are upbeat, and they're authentic, right? This is a group which thinks a little bit differently. 94% of millennials tried a new beer in the past month. So these are folks who are open to change. They like to try something new. So this month, new beer. Next month, new beer. Next month, new beer. So this is something that's driving this group. In fact, we have what we call beercations now, right? The map on the top right shows beercation. It's a map of the US, and my cousin is on who told me about this thing. He said, you know what? He bought all these apparatus. He's brewing all this stuff in his house, and it's a hobby. It's a hobby which is now making entrepreneurs out of it. And we don't need a Tesla. We don't need a big company, but it's something that is driven by very few individuals. The map on the bottom left shows this map that they put out that says that if those are the 10 best breweries to see the solar eclipse. So if you were to do a road trip, those are the places you want to hit, right? I doubt they'll be able to see what's going on by the time they get to the 10th one, but I don't know. These are interesting human beings. Then lastly, in as much as we talk about the tech industry, there are very many apps as well which are used in the brewery industry. Some of these, there's an app that will tell you how to make beer. There's an app that will tell you, ooh, there are 5 or 2 new breweries that showed up within 5 miles of your radius. There's an app that will connect you to your latest or to the newest brewer and deliver beer right to your doorstep within 15 minutes. There are apps. I think I have one. It's like a Facebook, and it's called Untap, and you keep in touch with friends, and it tells you, oh, there's something new. Maybe you move into a new city, and it tells you there's this is the type of taste buds that you have, and this is the drink that you would prefer, and this is where you need to go. So it's a word of mouth thing, but it's a technology. People are also intertwined through this. So ladies and gentlemen, a lot of things are happening in this industry. It's growing very fast, and I think even if you look at the data, they're talking about exports. Exports are so high. A lot of beer is being exported to Canada. They're making, I think last year the revenue was about $121 million in this industry. I don't think I have any other stories. Thank you so much. You guys are wonderful, and I'm glad to have talked to you today. Thank you.
All right, we will continue with not another economist, but a realtor. Please help me welcome to stage Derek Sprague. Derek is the Vice President and Broker for Sprague Real Estate and Mossy Oak Properties. He is also the Board President of the Bakersfield Association of Realtors. So he's here to give you an update on real estate in California in general and Bakersfield specifically. Please welcome Derek.
Thank you. Definitely not an economist. So, all right. I know I'm the last thing between you and a break, so let's jump right into it. I'm really thrilled. I'm absolutely thrilled to have this opportunity to be here. I've been coming to these for a long, long time and have learned something every time. And today's no different. Mr. Adams taught me who Mike Pence was, so that's going to be fantastic to take back. I thank him for that. And Dr. Gearhart told me that I'm the contributing the most obese cohort in history. And I just learned that's probably because I'm part of the 94% who drink beer when it comes out. So you guys might want to commission a study on that and see if there's some sort of correlation there. So yes, my name is Derek Sprague. I'm a commercial real estate broker, but I'm also president of the Bakersfield Association of Realtors, which makes me kind of unique in the fact that I don't really do a whole lot of residential, but I'm representing a membership that is largely residentially based. And so I've got a lot of data and statistics. A lot of the opinions aren't my own. I'm thankful to have some data from our chief economist for the state, Leslie Appleton Young. And I brought some of her stuff with me here. So green button seems like it's the best thing to move forward with. So the first thing I want to lead off with was to compare what's going on statewide in housing as it relates to Kern County. So statewide, there's been strong growth in the median price. If you look at the price for a home in California, the median price as of January 2018 was $527,800 for a home, which is up from last year, the year before, which was $491,000, close to $492,000, but still below the peak back in May 2007, which was close to $600,000. How that relates to Kern County? Well, the Kern County median price is $225,500, which is up 4.9% year over year, and kind of follows a similar track if you look at if you compare the two slides. I think it's interesting also to note to take a look at the average price per square foot for a home. It's the highest it's been since 2007 across the state. Back in November 2016, these slides are a little bit dated, but in November 2016, the price per square foot for a home in the state of California was $254. Now it's $277, and it continues to increase. If you look at the home sales, just in terms of units across the state, we're off to a slow start, but still within what we're forecasting for the year. Sales started off as of January down close to 3%, and Kern County followed a similar track. Kern County sales were down 3.8% year over year, but again, I think we're still in line to go with what we're projecting for the year. So you'll hear a lot of what we talk about and what other realtors talk about. There's an affordability issue in this state. We have a supply issue, and there's a lot of things contributing to it. The monthly housing affordability index is something that we track that measures whether or not a typical family who earns the median income can afford a typical home based on regional data. And across the state, that number's 29%. Kern County is one of the most affordable counties in the state at 54%. But it doesn't change the fact that every county in the state is still below the national average. So there's a couple contributing factors to that. One of the things that we look at is something called the unsold inventory index. The unsold inventory index is the number of months it would take to sell the remaining inventory for that month in question. And you can see that we've had negative growth in the unsold inventory index for the last couple of years. That unsold inventory index is sitting right between 2 and 4% statewide. On the long run, we've been tracking this since 1988. It's had a low of 1.3 months back in April 2004 and a high of 18 months back in 1991. But on the long run, it averages close to 7 months. So you can see how long we've been below the average, and that continues. There's nothing in sight that's going to change that. Kern County's a similar track. The Kern County Unsold Inventory Index, 2.9 months. If you look at Kern County in general, I was talking to some of my colleagues, and they said there's sort of a difference between houses that are $250,000 and lower and houses that are $300,000 and higher. If you look at houses that are $300,000 and higher, that's a lot of the new construction, and it doesn't move as quickly as the $250,000 homes and lower. So what else is going on? Well, longtime homeowners aren't moving like they have in the past. It could be a couple contributing factors. They might be wary of taking a capital gains hit. Maybe they're enjoying low property taxes right now that they don't want to lose. Maybe they have a low rate on their current mortgage that they don't want to walk away from. Just a demographic shift. A lot of people my age are living with their parents as opposed to going out and becoming homeowners. So, and then simply, where can I afford to go? When we're looking at this affordability issue across the state, if I sell my house, what am I going to do? Just go buy another house that's really expensive. So we've seen a very low turnover of homes. What else is contributing to it? Well, just as we're talking about mortgage rates have surged in recent weeks. We've seen growth in the last 8 weeks in both the fixed rate mortgage as well as the adjustable rate mortgage. And that's going to have a big impact on affordability as well, as it makes it more expensive to have a payment, and less people are going to be able to afford homes here. So this chart here tracks several years up to the last 8 weeks, and then shows the growth in mortgage rates for the last 8 weeks. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. You might have heard our Realtor Association come out and voice some concern over what was going on with tax reform. And it's not necessarily that we had any sort of opposition to tax reform. As a matter of fact, we're very much for tax reform. But the issue was more so in the fact that we didn't want it to be on the backs of home ownership. Our association believes in building strong communities around home ownership. And I think that when we looked at it, by doubling the standard deduction, it minimizes the value of the mortgage interest deduction. And that's what we think we're going to see, and that'll impact affordability. If the tax incentives of renting are the same as the tax incentives of owning, it really diminishes the value of owning a home. And so, if you look at what's been done by setting a high bar on the mortgage interest deduction, by setting a cap on property taxes and real estate deductions, that really impacts our state more so than other states. We've got this high median price that ultimately is going to have a negative impact on sales, on prices, and on inventory. So our chief economist, she put together her forecast, and then December came, tax reform got voted on, she had to put together a whole nother forecast. So presenting both forecasts from our state economist here. Before tax reform, she was projecting growth in the amount of units sold of 1%. After tax reform, she scaled that back down to 0.3%. Before tax reform, she was expecting the price of a median home in California to grow by 4.2%, scaled that back to 3.2%. So you can see the impact that we're seeing, or that we think is going to happen throughout this year. But most importantly is that housing affordability index. We think by the end of the year, only 26% of Californians are going to be able to afford a median priced home, and it's not getting any better. So that's something we're really concerned about. We're trying to do some things that we can control to throw out there to offer some solutions, but it's something that's really concerning. I'm not the only president of an association of realtors here in our county. We've got a couple associations of realtors. So I reached out to some of my colleagues to ask them about their market. Debbie Dibble, who's the president of the Ridgecrest Area Association of Realtors, was really optimistic about what's going on in Ridgecrest. They're really excited about the growth in the naval base and how that relates to housing, but she echoed the same concerns. Inventory is an issue. They don't have enough houses, and that's something that they're continually striving to try and develop more inventory of houses out there. Also, Tehachapi, my colleague Beth Hall up in Tehachapi was optimistic about their market as well, that they're seeing growth in Tehachapi, and they're excited about what's to come. So overall, I think that if you talk to colleagues both within Kern County and across the state, everyone's excited about how this impact of job growth and how the impact of housing continues to stable. We're not seeing highs and lows one way or the other, but I think that that stability also comes with the fact that there's not a whole lot of homes to sell, and it's a little scary. So now the exciting part is I get to talk about stuff that I'm a little bit more qualified to talk about. So my business also, I focus on agricultural sales, industrial sales, retail sales. And so I took a look at some of the stuff and just wanted to briefly touch on some of the other markets, since this is a real estate update and not just a residential update. So when it comes to ag, if you hear any stories about ag over the next year, it's probably going to be about water and about the impact of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. This is affectionately known as SGMA. SGMA was signed into law back in 2014 statewide, and it's basically forcing water stakeholders to come together and come up with solutions to prevent groundwater basins from being overdrafted. And right now, there's probably over 40 water districts in Kern County that are all trying to come together and figure out how they're going to implement their plan and move forward in a way that's going to make sense. And a lot of farmers are trying to figure out how exactly their plans are going to fit within that context. So I took a look also at some geographic information systems data, GIS. If you're not familiar with GIS, it's really powerful stuff. If you're interested in it, I'm sure my colleagues at Cal State will put together a tuition plan for you to go out and learn all about it. But basically, we've got some tremendous resources that are available from the County of Kern. And included in that is the crops permit data. So I took a look. This is a map that shows all of the crops that were planted based on the 2017 data that's available. And I was interested to look and see what's changed over the last decade. So this year there was about 750,000 acres of planted crops in Kern County, which, if you compare that to 2007, is about a 3.72% annual growth. So in 2007, there was 523,000. If you go 3.7% every year, it hasn't been tremendous growth one way or the other. But what I found interesting when I was looking at it was look at how it's not really, you don't see a whole lot of fringe development. You don't see areas that were planted that weren't planted before, like a desert oasis that's now all of a sudden planted in almonds and pistachios and grapes. It's really just areas where there was already prime farmland. You'd almost call it what we would call in commercial development, infill development, areas that were already capable of handling agricultural land that are now just being further developed. So I thought that was interesting, and then I went and wanted to drill down on some particular crops a little bit more. So let's look at pistachios. Back in 2007, there was 72,000 acres of pistachios. That represented close to 14% of that total crop back then. Fast forward to 2017, that number is 15% of today's crop. So the ratio of pistachios and the amount of planted acres they're taking up hasn't really changed over the last decade. What about almonds? Well, almonds were 33.3%. They were a third of the crop back in 2007. And now that share of planted acres actually came down to close to 31%. So still pretty relative, but you're seeing, or what was interesting to me was to see how the shares of crops haven't really changed when it comes to the amount of planted acres that's out there. And then surprisingly, grapes. So here's what the grape crop looked like back in 2007. It was 5% of that acreage back then. It grew to over 10.3% in 2017. So a lot of growth in the Delano, McFarland area, as well as the Arvin Edison area. All right, so also touching on a couple of the other submarkets when it comes to industrial. There's a lot of development success, and I think in all the other submarkets. So with industrial, I looked at some data from CoStar. CoStar is one of the leading real estate research companies. They're tracking 26 million square feet of industrial here in Bakersfield. And based on their data, they say that the industrial vacancy rate is 4.3%, and that rental rates here in Bakersfield are about 53 cents on average. Now, Southeast Bakersfield is a little bit of an outlier on that data, so if you take that part out, you're looking at industrial rental rates that are closer to 60 to 70 cents a square foot. So, if you look at the development success, Tahone's done an incredible job with bringing in IKEA and Caterpillar and Famous Footwear. Dollar General's out there. Wonderful's in the industrial development business with their 2 million square foot Ross building. 1.8 million square feet is leased to Target. American Tire Distributors has 1 million square feet. And then Wonderful's also developing 160 acres out near Meadows Field and another 80 acres out in southwest Bakersfield. So we're seeing a lot of development success when it comes to industrial, which is really encouraging. And I think part of that goes back to coming to these events and hearing about the opportunity that Kern County has when it comes to industrial and distribution. I see Barry here, and I remember seeing him speak when he was talking about the impact of being able to reach a bulk of the population in a one-day trip with the ability to go east on 58, north on 99 and I-5, and be able to go back down south in a way that really has affordable rents. And I think some of our developers are doing a really good job of sending that message, and hopefully it continues to grow. So then office, CoStar's tracking about 14 million square feet of office space here in Bakersfield, and the office vacancy rate, according to their data, is about 6.7%. And if you look at rental rates, they average about $1.54 a square foot. The 2.3 million square foot University Center submarket is the highest rental rates that you'll find in this area. The office rental rates are closer to $2. Retail rates are closer to $3 a square foot. And so there's a lot of that's where we're seeing a lot of the demand and a lot of development success in office as well. The Seven Oaks Business Park has got some great new tenants out there. Really excited and proud to see Valley Children's Specialty Care Center building out there on Stockdale Highway. And so there's a lot of exciting things when it comes to the office market, and a lot of it is medically driven, but nonetheless still exciting. And then in retail, so CoStar's tracking 22.6 million square feet of retail space, and they think the vacancy rate for retail is about 5.8%. And what's that mean when it comes to rental rates? Well, rental rates on average are about $1.13 a square foot. I think I'd probably tell you that there's a big discrepancy between new construction, maybe west side development rental rates, and existing rental rates outside of that, because rental rates for retail that's maybe newer or maybe in a more an area of higher demand are closer to $2.50 to $3 a square foot. So the high end of that average is really driving the low end. I also I was speaking. There's a lot of new retailers that are coming into town. It's really exciting. You see the Boulevard is fixing to open up, which is a new bowling alley over by Timbler. The Studio Movie Grill, which will give me the opportunity to drink the beer that my colleague talked about while I watch a movie. And then I was talking to my colleague Josh Shirley over at Cushman and Wakefield. He was talking about some of the other retailers that are opening or coming to town, including Texas Roadhouse Grill over at the mall. Ross and Dollar Tree, I believe, just opened over off Olive Drive. And I think Old Navy is moving into to the Gosford Village over there off Gosford and Coffee for their first non-mall retail storefront. So it's exciting to see retailers look at us. I know there's a couple more that are close to signing leases, and it's exciting to see all these things come together in a way that that sees our retail market grow. So I wanted to wrap up with some of the feedback from our chief economist to bring that back around as to what we expect for 2018. And that's, we're expecting job growth and the economy to grow throughout the year for our state to outperform that. Maybe it won't. There's a lot of what she calls slow-moving disasters when it comes to our state. So if you look at this housing affordability crisis and how that could weigh into things, if you look at the impact of pension funds and whether that comes around the corner, boomers not being prepared to retire, millennials and student home loan debt, skewing of income distribution, maybe institutions getting into the residential ownership business. There's just a lot of things that are right there on the horizon that could completely change the economist point of view and throw a curveball into it. So, at this point, based on everything that we're looking at, things look like they're continuing to grow at a normal rate, but any one of those could be a challenge. Rates will continue to rise. We're expecting them to rise throughout the year. Affordability continuing to be an issue. See if you can get some of my, for those of you that are housing my friends, my millennial friends that are still living with their parents, they can stay, but anyone else that I'm not friends with, you probably need to start pushing them into becoming homeowners. We'd certainly appreciate that. But my friends, they can stay as long as they need to. And then formerly owner-occupied units now becoming rentals. I think we're starting to see a trend where there's, we certainly don't want to be a nation of home renters. We want to be a nation of homeowners because that relates to being a strong community. But we're seeing a lot of people now converting over into rentals. And so we're keeping an eye on that. But overall, we're excited for this year. And that's all I have to say about that. It's all yours.
Great. We're going to get started on the aerospace and defense panel. So I guess a lot of cross-pollination has taken place. We're all optimistic moving forward, have the economist point of view. And we're really excited. Now we're gonna do an in-depth overview of the aerospace and defense industry. We have a slide about economic vitality in the county that was up previously. Talking about the wide array of industries, showing how we frankly are the envy and should be the envy of the U.S. if not world in terms of the diversity of our industries. And so today we're going to do a deep dive into aerospace defense. We have China Lake, we have Edwards, Mojave, we have significant technology invented it. We have, believe it or not, over 50 world firsts came out of China Lake. And so aerospace industry, in terms of our economy, employs about 22,000 folks, and that's just directly. It's not the indirect and induced portion. We know that we're number 4 for STEM jobs in the country, number 9 for engineering, and a lot of that has to do with what's happening in the aerospace and defense industry. And so we're going to get started Scott O'Neill is going to be our first speaker. We're going to precede his overview with a video, but just to let you know, Scott O'Neill is the Executive Director of the Indian Wells Valley, EDC. Previously, he served, as he'll tell you, I believe 40, you must not age, but 40 plus years as Executive Director and Director of Research and Engineering for Naval Air Warfare Center Weapons. I just call it NAS, but in China Lake, he was in charge of 5,200 employees. And you haven't aged either, so that's a great testament. Looking at his background, he has 3 degrees. BA Mechanical Engineering, old stomping ground, Seattle. Master's in Mechanical Engineering, USC. And to wrap that up, he's an MA in Management from MIT. Well, that's hard to top that. So as Scott will tell you, the China Lake, NAS, basically creates a payroll of over $530 million a year. And it's very interesting. You see the workforce moving into there. There's a new cohort of 200 moving in this year. The average age is actually decreasing. You're getting the millennials and the like moving in. So you're having that again, not to be dead horse, that cross-pollination of all ages. And that's the thing. We were concerned about the aging out of the workforce. That's not happening in China Lake. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Scott with his video, a minute and a half video of some of the activities in China Lake and Indian Wells Valley.
Sailors are forged from the sea.
Their weapons are forged at Knock WD.
Here's just some of the things we do.
We research and develop weapons that make the warfighter more lethal, and rapidly develop capabilities that keep our armed forces ahead of the game.
Whether we're building a better bomb or designing a software interface, the warfighter comes first.
We test weapons in real and virtual environments.
Modeling, simulation, and live testing are all combined to ensure that our weapons meet the warfighter's needs.
We dominate the electromagnetic spectrum.
We bring 65 years of e-warfare expertise to the fight.
We make it possible to reliably put bombs and missiles on target.
Great introduction. Scott O'Neill, please.
Any other questions? Richard, thank you for having us here. And I'm the Executive Director of the Economic Development Corporation for the Indian Wells Valley, which includes Ridgecrest and, of course, the military base at China Lake. The base at China Lake also has a campus at Point Mugu. So not only do we have inland ranges, but we have the sea ranges, and some of the tests you saw off over the water were done off the Point Mugu Sea Range. So anyways, I think Kern County is postured for the future very well. I think what we heard this morning from the economists and looking at our local economies, things are looking pretty bright, I think. But I do think that a lot of the growth in Kern County, and I think one of the opportunities we've got, and I think the assets we've got, really is in the diversification of our industries. And over the last 20 years, you've seen commercial space grow out in Mojave. The defense at China Lake and at Edwards Air Force Base has done nothing but get stronger. And it will continue to grow as we bring on the Joint Strike Fighter, or the F-35, into both the Air Force and the Navy arsenals. And there'll be a lot of work to work out that weapon system and get our weapons compatible with that particular jet. So that's exciting. I do think that the growth that we see in the county is not only going to be in the traditional areas, but I think aerospace, renewable energies, and space access are going to be critically, and it's going to be huge. But one of my jobs as the Economic Development Corporation is to try to support, from an economic perspective, the Navy in the region. My cohort, Dave Janis, who is the executive director of the China Lake Alliance, which is a 501c4 corporation that supports the mission of the base, is here also. Dave, can you stand up and let people see who you are there? And because his job is also very important, because he gets to support the base in a way that the base can't support itself, and that's through supporting lobbying and things like that to make sure that the interest and the mission of the base is preserved through the Congress and through some of the support in those ways. So, but what is the Navy doing in Ridgecrest? The Navy's got 1.1 million acres of ranges, instrumented ranges out in the desert. The airspace over those ranges, R2508, is a restricted airspace that covers 1/8 of the airspace over California. It's jointly managed by the general at Edwards Air Force Base and the general over at Fort Irwin on the eastern edge with the admiral at China Lake. And so that asset is something that we couldn't put together today. It's been in place since 1943, and it's when the military really started moving into the valley. It was during the World War II years, and it's done nothing but grow. So the economy in the area is booming. You saw that this morning. Housing is in dire need. The base has been growing about, I'd say around, economically it's been growing about 15% a year. Right now the base did about $1.6 billion of business last year. And it's growing again at about 13 to 15%. The workforce at China Lake is growing about 5%. So where's the delta? The delta's in contracting. The base contracts out about $1 billion a year. $219 million of that is in Kern County. Okay? The base uses its credit card about $30 million a year. $3 million of that is spent in Kern County. That's through the credit card programs. And so I think that's going to continue to grow as the base itself continues to get more and stronger economically. And you'll see that in budgets. The military budgets are going up this year, if we'd ever get it passed. But the forecast is continued growth, and that just means nothing but I think goodness for both Edwards and China Lake. So growth is important. The median income, or the average income in the Ridgecrest area, is about $77,000 a year. Our entry-level salaries for kids out of college are about $65,000 a year. There is no housing available for them. So we are talking to builders, to be able to address that. So there's opportunity in that area. Commerce is growing. Of course, one of my jobs is quality of life, trying to make sure that we've got a place that people want to live so that we can retain those employees. But the education level in Ridgecrest is very high. We've got a significant portion of our citizenry both have bachelor's and master's and PhDs. And so it's fairly highly educated. And so we see positive growth. We see the Eastern Kern as a huge engine for the future of Kern County in general. And so I look forward to the dialogue that we'll have later this morning.
Thank you, Scott. And if anyone's interested, we spearhead an initiative called East Kern Economic Alliance. We're meeting in Ridgecrest tomorrow at 2 o'clock, Kern McGee Center. And yeah, it's amazing going out there and just seeing, literally meeting rocket scientists and firsthand experience. So so Scott represents, obviously, China Lake activity, Indian Wells Valley, EDC, and we also want to move into discussion, which Roger will be about his company that's really taken off dynamically over the last few years. He's a very modest guy from Georgia, right, from near where I grew up, and he is the CEO of Sierra Technical Services. So when you think of UAVs and drones, these are not the ones that weigh about a pound that you can buy on Amazon. In fact, I asked Roger to bring it here, but he said it weighs a couple of tons. And it has, let's see, it's a 40-foot long as well as 24-foot wingspan. So not really conducive to bring it in here. But Roger, so according to their website, it's 5 GAT. It's 5 GAT, correct? Which means fifth generation aerial target. Yes. So, and he previously worked with BAE Systems. He has a civil engineering degree from Southern Polytech State, and really excited to. He does not have a video of things blowing up, but he does have an exciting PowerPoint, and the fonts are really amazing. But I wanted him to visualize what they're doing. So Roger Hayes.
Thank you. I started this company in 2006 after retiring from first Lockheed, after 21 years at the Lockheed Skunk Works, and then 6 years at BAE Systems in Mojave. I started this company primarily to develop that target. And that target you're looking at looks like just a regular little fighter airplane, has no cockpit. It is strictly an aerial target. And we have a contract. We won a contract a year ago this month to design and build at least one of these. The contract allows for up to 4 of them with options. We've been expecting the government to issue a option 2 any day now, but the continuing resolutions that the Congress was going through kept delaying and delaying and delaying that. But we still expect any time now to be turned on to build the second aircraft. First aircraft is in production. If you look at the size of the airplane, it's like I said, 40 feet long, has a 24-foot wingspan. It has 2 jet engines with afterburners, and so it's quite a maneuverable fighter-like airplane. The U.S. Air Force and Navy have been shooting at aerial targets since the 1940s, remote-controlled airplanes since the 1940s. Most people think of drones as something that's come about in the last 10 years. It's been a long time. Most of the time, the government converts old fighter airplanes into drones, but unfortunately, they're running out of old fighter airplanes, and none of the old fighter airplanes represent the threats that we see currently today. Chinese just introduced a new J-20 stealth fighter, very similar to the F-22 in size, shape, and performance. The Russians have an Su-57 or T-50, which is also similar to size, shape, and stealthiness of the F-22. So we're no longer, because of budget cuts over the last couple of, maybe decade or so, we have not leading the industry or the world and development of these type of things like we did many years before that. We've allowed the other countries to catch up. And so this target is planned to provide a stealthy threat representative aerial target for our Air Force, Navy, Army to shoot at. Yeah, they'll shoot it down. To test their weapon systems, make sure that an air-to-air missile works against a stealthy target. If you don't test it before you engage in one, then you might not like the outcome. So they've been doing this right now. The Air Force shoots at QF-16s, which they take an F-16 fighter, convert it into a drone, and they shoot at it out over the Gulf of Mexico or Holloman Air Force Base down in New Mexico. And they've been doing this for years and years and years. But the F-16 does not have any stealth features. So this target, once it's completed, when it goes into production, would be more threat representative than anything that's in the inventory today. So there's a comparative picture to show you the size of it relative to an F-16C, which is a typical Air Force aircraft. I mentioned the Air Force. I also should include the Navy and the Army. They all shoot at it. The Army shoots it. They practice ground-to-air missiles to make sure they understand that they will hit stealthy targets, that they can track them. And the Navy also flies against these targets. up until recently, the Navy used to have their own QF-4s out of Point Magoo, but that stopped doing that now. They all shoot at QF-16s off the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, the next slide. This is an aircraft that we helped develop for a company out of Sacramento and Roseville. They came to us to ask us to help them design a stealthy aircraft. It's unmanned. It's about 30 feet long, and it carries small diameter bombs. It has no pilot. It's remotely programmed and can take off and land, or it doesn't land, it recovers by parachute. But they asked us to help because we have experience in designing stealthy aircraft, and they did not. That company is called Kratos. They took the design that we developed for them, and they used it in their proposal submittal to Air Force Research Labs out of Dayton, Ohio, and they won the contract with that design against Lockheed and Northrop and Boeing and General Atomics. Then they come to us and said, since you helped us win the design, will you help us build this aircraft? So we agreed to help design and build their 3 prototypes. We are currently in production of that right now. The prototype, we're building the aft part of the fuselage, the very back end where the engine's located, the engine mounts, the internal structure, the external skins. We're building the parachute bay doors. We're building the weapons bay doors, the wing leading edges, and a number of other parts and pieces for Kratos for those 3 aircraft. If the government decides to go in production of that, there's a good chance that we would be called upon to help with that as well. We located our company in Tehachapi. We started off in Mojave. I did consulting work at Scale Composites for about 3 years, and at the spaceship company for a couple of years. And as the company decided to branch from just tooling into composite manufacturing, we moved to Tehachapi. We've got great support from the city there with a great talent base of people in the aerospace business, both engineers, composite fabricators, A&P mechanics, and the like that live in the Tehachapi area that currently work either in Tehachapi, Mojave, Edwards Air Force Base, or in Palmdale with the other giants. So
great, thanks, Roger. And as we move left to right, we also move from east to west Kern, and in helping to tell the story of our industry. And we have Matt Johnston, who I'm not sure if you've toured his facility. It's a 22-acre facility and a campus at Meadows Field. And really the training, right, where the next generation of pilots, et cetera, aeronautics professionals going to come from. And so he's doing that right in our backyard. I did tour the campus. They have simulators, so they put me in one and it started smoking. I thought, you know, I played asteroids and time pilot growing up, so I assumed I would be really, you know, top notch. But he told me to leave the campus, so hopefully I'll come back. I may have destroyed the machine. Anyway, Matt, you know, this is, frankly, he's positioning it as the premier West Coast facility for training. I think they have a satellite office campus in Oxnard as well, and the next generation of talent. So as after Matt speaks, we're going to have kind of a Q&A talking about workforce and opportunities moving forward. But as a bookend, he does have a video to complement the PowerPoint in the previous video. So
it doesn't have bombs in it.
Oh, no bombs. Good. We don't want that. So if we have ability to play. Johnston.
We're kind of a little secret out here at Meadows Field, and well, thanks for having us today. Well, all of these things that happen in Kern County that revolve around aviation, and I don't think many people recognize how much aviation takes place in Kern County. We're fortunate that about 4 years ago we were able to come in and acquire this facility to provide training for aviation professionals as pilots and other support technicians to basically prepare all the people that need to take us on vacation. You get on planes, turn to the right, we take care of everything, turns to the left and is on the ground and in the offices to make everything get in the air and take us places. We do have a 22-acre facility. I invite all of you guys to come out and tour it and take a look. We're accredited, Part 141, FAA approved institution. We focus on really immersing the students into everything they need, fully focused in aeronautics only. And so we're able to complete a 4-year bachelor's degree in 3 years because they go year-round. We keep them flying, we keep them focused. They complain about not having, spring breaks and all those great things. And I talk to parents and they're like, well, it's kind of like their freshman year. They should be able to get away with things. It's like, no, they're kind of like flying a $300,000 aircraft. They need to stay a little focused. So looking forward to the Q&A and telling you a little bit more about the different shortages that exist out there and how we're serving the community. But we're happy to be here in Kern County and fill the skies with a bunch of future pilots and other support technicians.
Great. Well, we'll start the Q&A. Actually, we'll go from Matt. Start with Matt about looking at your competitive position. So, what trends, be it global, national, regional, are affecting your either positively or negatively your competitive position as an educational institution?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question.
Okay.
It's a great question.
Thank you.
Actually, one of the things that people don't realize, aviation, again, it's one of those mysteries, right? People look at it and think, oh, it's unsafe, or but we're all willing to buy an airline ticket, get on a plane, and go somewhere. And we are in a period right now where we're experiencing over the next 20 years an incredible shortage to the supply of professional aviation professionals in all categories. I mean, from engineers to pilots to technicians that keep the planes flying. A Boeing study that was done just in July of 17 is projecting over 41,000 aircraft deliveries worldwide. The United States or North America being part of a considerable delivery. Pilots, over 637,000 pilots are going to be needed in the next 20 years. I mean, do the math and how many pilots that's going to be needed. Just in North America alone, 117,000 pilots. The technicians actually are in greater demand. There's over 648,000 worldwide technicians, mechanics that need to repair and keep these aircraft flying that are needed, just 118,000 alone in North America. And then the cabin crew that takes care of everything that's airborne and these crews, 839,000 cabin crew are going to be needed. So there's a lot of deficiency occurring. The military's just always been kind of the place where people, these airlines have been fortunate to receive their staffing, and that's just decreasing. And California Aeronautical University is, positioning ourselves to help serve this sector in all regards for all positions.
Great, thank you. And Roger, I know you alluded to some of the trends and opportunities as well on the global basis.
Yeah, as far as the engineers and aerospace professionals, there is a huge shortage. My company is hiring today. We've got multiple positions open. We have grown since, let's say, in 2015, early 2015. We were a company of about 6 or 7 people full-time and about a half a dozen contractors. Now we've got about 60 or 62 employees and contractors full-time, and our growth prediction is to double that within the next 12 months. And the opportunity, if this target that we developed were to go into production, is that could quadruple in a few years. So opportunities in aerospace is extraordinary. I can't emphasize it enough to the students in school. If you guys, got a lot of millennials here, so you got a lot of students in schools to emphasize in science and math, and the opportunities are tremendous, and they're going to continue to be shortages. The DoD budgets are now increasing, so our field, all of us involved in anything DoD related, is going to grow, at least over the next 6 or 7 years.
I just want to add that that's part of the challenge, is educating people on these opportunities and getting out there, and really, because it's such a gap in understanding at high school levels, counselors, people just only can relate to the kind of vacation aspect of aviation, but there's so much. I mean, these gentlemen represent that industry. I mean, we've got a sim bus that we run around to high schools and community fairs just to try to expose people that there's tons to do in the aviation.
And the wage levels are obviously much greater than the county average, or I imagine in terms of pilots, the wage, you say that the trend is a significant upwards as the talent pool dries up. The wage levels have increased significantly.
Oh yeah, as Scott mentioned, starting wage for a new graduate engineer is in the mid-60s, and so that's with no experience, and that's pretty good. That's a pretty good salary to start with. Our shop technicians that do composite fabrication are making anywhere from $20 to $35 an hour. So this is a high-tech industry, and so it pays well.
And Scott, you obviously have been dealing with the, this kind of goes into the talent attraction, retention, but with BRAC and et cetera, the competitive challenges and opportunities, not just human resources, but in terms of innovation competition. What are you seeing in terms of those trends?
Yeah, the competition there is pretty heavy. I think there's just a general demand in science and engineering fields across the country. So we have to compete with for all those kids coming out of school, especially entry level, and because we're more of a rural community that's kind of remote, we recruit a lot from the Midwest, and so when we talk about Kern County and try to attract young professionals to the Eastern Kern, we do talk about opportunities, not only the technical opportunities, but kind of where they're living. They all do site visits in truth and advertising. So so coming from the Midwest, though, a lot of them are familiar with agriculture, and there are a lot of them are also familiar with some of the alternative energy and the oil industry. So that's always something of interest. But primarily, the reason they come to the desert is for the technology and for the technical work that goes on. It's very interesting, and I think that one of the challenges is, since we do recruit a lot from outside of California, most of the new hires at the Navy base are imports, if you will, and so keeping them and retaining them is critical. And so quality of life and making sure that they have opportunity to raise their families in a healthy and prosperous environment is critical, and making also sure that they have opportunity for career growth. And I think that's another thing that the Eastern Kern with Mojave and with what goes on up at Tehachapi and down at Edwards Air Force Base, there's some opportunity for those who want to expand their career fields and their technical expertise, to stay regional, local, and but get different experiences. So I think that's really important. But there is a shortage of scientists and engineers, and making sure that we attract our fair share is hugely critical. I think one of the things we see from the millennials is they do have a real strong sense of service, and so really coming into to our workforce and working in defense is something that that they all aspire to, and somewhat of a higher calling, if you will.
Well, we're hitting on some of the themes. Unfortunately, we only have a few more minutes, but I want to, in a nutshell, how each of you pitched Kern County, be it to folks coming back or staying here, or to that new talent pipeline. of people not familiar with Kern County. What is your elevator? You're going down the elevator, let's say from the 4th floor. What do you tell them if you're in the elevator? Why they should come to this county?
Well, I can say one of it is the excitement of what's going on. You know, we're talking about Eastern Kern. We're talking, and there's a lot of intellectual property being developed in the Eastern Kern in the aerospace and the renewable energy fields, and that's exciting in and of itself. You know, the research department at China Lake is heavily involved in not only the sciences that are needed for defense, but for alternative oil sources and things like that. So I think one of the things that they're excited about is just what is going on in the area. You know, space access in Mojave is exciting, and what Roger's doing up at Tehachapi with stealth technology and composites is exciting. So I think that's the big thing beyond just what the other opportunities across the county are.
And Roger, the elevator just got to the bottom floor. Good job, they're coming.
Well,
so Roger?
The easy thing for us is once they come to Tehachapi and they see Tehachapi, they think, okay, I can live here. This is a beautiful country. It's a land of 4 seasons. We've got great weather. And if you want to be in the aerospace industry at all, Tehachapi, Mojave, even Antelope Valley is the place to be. That is the cutting edge of anywhere in this country for aerospace, especially DoD-related type of work. Anything like that that's going on, it's happening right here in Kern County, in Tehachapi, Mojave, Ridgecrest, and even down into Antelope Valley and Palmdale. So it's an easy sell once they come to see Tehachapi, because it's a beautiful place to live.
Great. And then Matt,
we're on floor, what, 75 right now?
Well, you're probably on the 2nd floor now.
They warned me about that. For all the reasons they said. I mean, we're talking on a daily basis to families that are looking to send their children to Kern County. And we're also, you know, we currently employ 60 people on field. We're going to be at 150 students by the end of this year, and growing. We have 300 beds on campus. We're constantly explaining to the families what a good exposure Kern County can offer them for the centralization we have to LA, San Francisco. For the pilots, it's the flying conditions. I mean, the airspace in Kern County is absolutely, bar none, the best.
Most moderate temperature as well as climate in the country, right?
Everywhere. I mean, it's just it's good conditions all around for aerospace, and we're happy to be here and training the next generation of those individuals.
Well, and it's interesting segues. You know, I like segues. Last night at the dinner for sponsor speakers, the chicken was called airline chicken. Apparently, it exists. But look it up, Google it. But credit to you and all you're doing at CAU. And a credit to you, the 3 of you, in terms of really at the forefront, the pioneers of, I think, where Kern County's headed and why the best practices are occurring in our backyard. So we all need to go, as I said, serve as ambassadors for amazing work. And thank you again for all that you do for our region.
Thank you.
But before we go into our keynote presentation, we wanted to brief the group to an effort that is going on to help tell the story of Kern County and Bakersfield and how great we are, what cool things we have going on here, what vibrant industries that we have here. So the Chamber, KEDC, the County of Kern, the City of Bakersfield has been working with the consortium of private sector partners to try to develop a new brand strategy for our region. And so I'd like to invite Joe Renfro, who's the Executive Vice President of Tejon Ranch, who chairs the steering committee that's putting this together, to tell you a little bit more about it and talk about the guest we have here today. Joe.
Thank you, Nick, and I'll be brief so we can get to Mr. Don McCann, President and CEO of North Star Destination Strategies. As Nick alluded to, we've engaged North Star to help us in a branding development effort. And by the slide that's up on the screen, by the speakers who've come before you today, there's a lot of great reasons to do business and to relocate and retain your business in Kern County and the city of Bakersfield. But as we all know, our community brand is our cultural connection to commerce and our ticket to economic prowess. But what we think of ourselves a lot of times is overshadowed by possibly how we're perceived elsewhere. That's the reason for what Nick alluded to, the public-private partnership that's been developed. About 15 companies throughout the city and the county, the city of Bakersfield, the county of Kern, economic KEDC, city of Bakersfield Chamber of Commerce, all coming together in a true public-private partnership, both in terms of time and economic investment in what we believe is essential, what I believe everybody in this audience would believe is essential, and that has led us to the engagement of Don and his company at North Star for very valid reasons. They are the experts in what they do. They bring passion and proven demonstrated experience. They've done community branding efforts for about 300 communities, both large and small, all the way up to statewide levels across the United States. We're lucky to have them, and as Don would tell you, he's not here necessarily to create the strategy for us. He's here to kind of uncover the DNA that exists and help bring it out, bring it to importance to the audiences that matter most. So with that, hope you'll join me in welcoming Don McCann to the stage.
Good morning. It's a treat to be with you. Branding has a branding problem. Let me ask a quick question. How many of you have ever moved somewhere or relocated your business or invested somewhere because they had a great logo and a slogan? Well, you'll be glad to know that's not what this is about. How many of you love the community where you live and serve? Absolutely. Well, putting that passion to work is what this is about. Decisions are made every day in boardrooms and nonprofit boards and council chambers and conference rooms and dinner tables and breakfast tables and bars that affected the future of Bakersfield and Kern County. Now imagine those decisions being made in light of an overarching, approved, distinct strategy. Intuitively, that just makes some sense, doesn't it? It's certainly been our experience over the last 20 years helping communities be as competitive as they can. There's even a terrific study by the EuroCities Association that measured investment and quality of life measures with 40 mid-sized European cities over 10 years. And essentially the finding was places generally become more competitive and see improvements in their overall reputation when all the main sectors of a community are aligned to a common strategy. Now notice they didn't say a common logo. So do me a favor, in front of your piece of paper, draw an X somewhere on a piece of paper. That is my slick visual for this morning. Think about that X like an hourglass, and that is the scope of work we're going to be doing together. And the top of that hourglass is a lot of research in a lot of different ways and talking to a lot of people. And I hope to talk to as many of you today as I possibly can. We're also going to talk to people outside of your community, perceptions and attitudes and beliefs about Bakersfield and Kern County, and understand that perspective. We're going to understand the competitive situation and eventually take all of that good data and insight and develop a strategy, a DNA, and that is the neck of that hourglass about what is authentic, distinct, and ownable in the marketplace. And articulate that in terms of strategy first. And distinct is the hard part, right? I wish I had $1 for every time I've heard small town charm and big city amenities. That may be incredibly relevant, but it's not the least bit distinct. So there's got to be some focus in this strategy. Got to plant your flag somewhere. It's tough to do. It's tough for communities to do, especially when you have so many great things to talk about like you do. But that strategy has got to provide some focus and a competitive framework to tell all of the great things that you have to say, but to be able to tell them in a Bakersfield way, to be able to tell them in a Kern County way and tone of voice. So that's what we're up to. The bottom half of that hourglass is then how do you take that thought and put it to work in the stuff that you do. So individually as organizations, private sector, and public, and yes, in communications and messaging, but also ideally policy and development and what you celebrate, what you incentivize, and how you live into that strategy that affects the experience someone has for you. We're off to a great start, learning lots. You've got a lot to be proud of. We're enjoying ourselves learning about your community, and please, if you have a chance to talk to me or Ed, raise your hand in the back of the room. Please come say hello to us this afternoon, and we're looking forward to our work together. Thank you very much.
So now, thank you all for staying with us throughout the morning for the 18th Annual Economic Summit. We will now turn to our keynote speaker, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. Dr. Victor Davis Hanson is the Martin and Illie Anderson Senior Fellow in Residence in Classics and Military History, Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and a Professor Emeritus of Classics at California State University. Beyond his academic background, I think we most know Dr. Hanson as a frequent commentator on policy issues affecting the Central Valley, Kern County, and California. I think he provides a great perspective about the Central Valley's role in the success of California, and I think we are all very much looking forward to his insights today. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Victor Davis Hanson to the stage.
Thank you very much. I thought I would speak for 30 minutes on the good, bad, and good prognosis of California. But let me start with the good first, and then we'll go to the bad, and we'll end with the good. We were very lucky to be born or to live in California because, you know, if you look at all of the traditional ingredients that make a society develop through history or boom, we have everything. We're the third largest state, now we're the most populous, but more importantly, people came to California because if you look at the building blocks of society throughout history, food, fuel, shelter, we had everything. We could be again the second largest timber producer. We're already, even in our state of decline as far as not utilizing all of our natural resources, we're third in energy production, oil production. First in agriculture, and that's because very rarely do you see in the world the Sierra Nevada mountains with that watershed juxtaposed to the climate and soils right next to it, a desert Mediterranean climate. I mean, you can see it in Chile, you can see it in North Africa, Greece, the coast of Turkey, but very few places in the world have that combination. Very rarely do you see a coastline of 900 miles, and given the transition in the world economy from a neo-socialist paradigm in Europe that's not as dynamic as a sort of free market capitalist paradigm in Asia, this coastline is much more valuable than the one in the East Coast. We're a window on China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and these are economies that are dynamic in a way that the European economies are no longer dynamic. So we've got mountains, we've got weather, we've got the soil, we've got size. We're juxtaposed to a foreign country, Mexico. Most importantly, though, that climate and those natural advantages brought a particular type of Californian in the late 19th century and 20th century that wanted to take advantage of that natural bounty, and it brought entrepreneurs, buccaneers, privateers, good and bad, but they all had one thing in common. They were very audacious and they were imaginative. And I'll just give you a few examples of what I mean. Any of you been up to Huntington and Shaver Lake? Henry Huntington wanted to develop what we now know as Huntington Beach. There was no electricity in those times, or the ability to make electricity through steam was very limited. So he had John Eastman go up on the San Joaquin River. In the space of 2 years, 1912 to 1913, they built Huntington, and then later Shaver, and then Florence. They built 1,000 megawatt energy production. This is in the 1912, 13, 14. They didn't know if the penstocks could handle 2,000 foot drop from Huntington all the way to Big Creek, so they had the Krupp arms manufacturers who built battleship barrels shipped into California. They transmitted the electricity. Nobody thought you could do it. 200 miles, and they electrified Los Angeles and allowed people to take a trolley and live on the beach, which was a suburb of Los Angeles. If you look at the California Water Project under Governor Pratt Brown, we confused the two Browns. You got to remember that Jerry Brown's father, Pat Brown, sued the Sierra Club in 1958 to start the California Water Project. And if you go back and read some of his speeches, they're very visionary. And he would say things like, unfortunately, this state has 2/3 of the people live where, or actually it's 3/4, he said 2/3, where there's no water, and only 1/3 is where there's water. And rather than just accepting that as an environmental fact, he sought to change it. First, by encouraging further development of the California, the Central Valley Project, which was federal, and then merging it with the California Water Project. It's the largest water project in the world. Even the penstocks right over here that go up over the Grapevine are the longest still in existence, tallest. And the tragedy, of course, if you look at what he said, is when he did this, it was 15 or 16 million people, and it was calibrated each 5 years to fit 40 million, our present population, on to 60 million. But in our infinite wisdom or ignorance, we canceled the tertiary phase of 3 or 4 more dams that would have given us another 10 million acre feet, and insured growth could go easily up to 50 or 60 million. But the point is that we had people like that. If you look at David Packard and Bill Hewitt that came to Stanford University, really went to the engineering project, and they were the godfathers of what we now know as Silicon Valley, way before Apple and Facebook and Google. And their attitude was that the university was not going to be just an ivory tower, but it would have pragmatic ramifications. And between the two horns of UC Berkeley and Stanford University, this was a unique opportunity to grow Silicon Valley. It was not an accident that it grew where it did, and the type of people who were the entrepreneurs that developed it. If you look at Pat Brown and Glenn Dumke, the chancellor of the state university system, we were a hodgepodge university system like most states. But the tripart master plan, 9 UC campuses, now with UC Merced 10, 23 now state college campuses, and then over 60 community college, and they were all layered and integrated. Nobody had ever done that before. Most people thought if you were back east, you see small private liberal arts. It's a good paradigm, but they're not systematic. We don't really have that pattern. We have a Pepperdine or we have Loyola, but basically we had confidence in public education, tuition free until 1967. It was a brilliant idea of educating. It was based on mass participation of democracy. It's another good example. If you look at people like Henry Mayer or Sam Goldwyn or Irving Thalberg who went into Hollywood, these were mostly Jewish Americans who were refugees from Eastern Europe. They liked the climate of Hollywood. They were very interested in developing themes of Americanism, especially as juxtaposed to their antithesis they'd grown up with in Eastern Europe and in Germany, and they really created Hollywood out of nothing. And so when you look at universities, we could also talk about the freeway system. Pat Brown's original vision, he said he could dream of a day when I-5, 99, and 101 would all be 6 lanes. Arnold Schwarzenegger said that when he left, that would happen too. It never did happen. I have to drive home to Selma from, this afternoon, and when I get to the Delano 4-lane bottleneck, I don't know if I'm going to run over a mattress, a shovel, or a bin. It's one of the, I always plan an extra 2 hours. And I drove last night to give you what's happened. We used to have the most impressive airports in the United States. LAX was really, I mean, it's a mess now, but it was considered state of the art. And yet I sat last night, Monday night, 7 hours at the Palm Springs airport until the flight was canceled at midnight. And you'd think it would be pretty easy to get here from Palm Springs yesterday, but believe me, that 220 miles on the California freeway system is a very uncertain experience. What I'm getting at is we had all of these natural advantages that brought all of these men of genius and daring, and they created a utopia that turned out, as it still is, the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. And then something started to happen in the 80s, 90s, and the 21st century. And it's a very complex, it's easy to demagogue it or say it's these people are bad or these people are good, but it's more of a, I don't see it as melodrama, more of tragedy. And what happened was, I'll just give you the symptoms as a doctor, and then we can see if we can come up with a diagnosis and then offer a treatment and prognosis. But if you look at some of the symptoms, we have 1 out of every 3 people on public assistance lives in California. 23% of Californians live below the poverty line. The CSU system, when I started teaching there, was struggling with graduating 50% of the people in 4 years, and we had this new program called remediation. 28% of the incoming class did not satisfy high school math and English, and yet we were admitted under special circumstances. Today, 48% do not graduate in 6 years, and the remediation rate has gone up to 55%, to such a degree that the CSU system often does not use the word remediation. At least in some campuses, it's 55. So something has changed radically. If you look at the income tax, sales tax, and gas tax, that basket, whether we count Hawaii or not, is really pretty consistently, we're the highest tax state in the union. If you look at commensurate benefits, as I mentioned, our schools at the higher education are under challenge, but K through 12, depending on what rubric we use, because usually the right uses more pessimistic and the left uses more optimistic, and they're subject to interpretation, but between the sidelines, there's a common consensus. We're about 45, 43, 46 in high school test scores. We used to be consistently 10 and 11. So we're not producing, our public high schools are not producing the type of college graduates that are going to be competitive, not just with other states, but with the world at large. That's a challenge. If you look at what we get for what is going to be this graduated new gas tax, we may end up higher than Connecticut in our aggregate gas tax. And yet Forbes 2 years ago rated California infrastructure 49 out of 50. So we're kind of confronted with an Orwellian situation. We are asked to provide the most generous taxes to government, and in return we don't get the type of services that other states do with much less of a tax burden. That's the symptoms. Now, what caused this? What happened from the vision of Henry Huntington and Bill Hewitt and Dave Packard, Pat Brown? What was causing this? And I think one of the answers was there was an influx of great poverty without traditional methods to remedy it, and great wealth. As I said, we have 22% of the population lives below the poverty line. I didn't say that we have the most billionaires, 77 billionaires in the world live right in California, in the closest proximity, most of any other state. So what we see is that Facebook, Apple, Google, in aggregate, control half of the world's internet revenues. They're capitalized at somewhere between 1.5 trillion, which is about the size of the California economy each year, the GDP, to $2 trillion. So we have an enormous amount of wealth. Just to take one example, I'm not mentioning Hollywood is still, even in the days of its decline, is still very lucrative. Times Educational Supplement rated the 20 top universities in the world. It was a British, not an American effort. 13 of the 20 were American, 5 of them were California. The top one was Caltech, number 3 was Stanford, 6 was UC Berkeley. Those are enormous resources, but they're also enormous money earners. They spin off industries, they bring in foreign students that pay through the nose in high tuition. So we have all of these assets, and the result was that part of the state got very, very wealthy. At the same time, people who were fed up with the high taxes and the lack of commensurate services, 4 million in the last 25 years have fled the state. If you go to State Line, Nevada, or Reno, or Boise, or places like Austin, it's almost like you can see a Fresno or a Bakersfield person on the street. It's a phenomenon. When I speak in Boise, people wave all the time. So there was a flight of entrepreneur, mostly in the 70 to 100,000 income bracket. At the same time, and it's a controversial, I don't want to get into the illegal immigration, Donald Trump was in California, but we had about 20 million people enter the United States illegally. That wouldn't have been necessarily that much of a challenge had we gone back to the old melting pot formula of Pat Brown of integration, assimilation, intermarriage, and it's still working, but with such numbers, half of all people who entered the United States illegally came into California. And unlike previous immigrations from Central America and Mexico, if you look at the per capita income of people who came as undocumented, they did not have the levels of English and per capita income that prior migrations from Mexico. They were mostly from southern Mexico, not from northern Mexico. In other words, it was a more challenging project. And yet we in the state failed our duty to assimilate, insist on English, and use the melting pot in the way that we had. So we have enormous numbers of people, of indigenous people who were very poor, who came into California, and that caused a radical restructuring of the budget. Under Pat Brown in 1960, about a third of the budget was spent on infrastructure and about 7% was spent on social services. Now it's about 40% on social services and about 7% on infrastructure. It's flipped. And you can see the results, that the infrastructure is not up to the population or the needs of the people. And this is causing a lot of tension. So great wealth made a lot of people in California exempt from the ramifications of their own ideology. Let me elaborate on that kind of poorly worded phrase. So when you had people in Hollywood and you had people in the defense industry and the banking industry and the universities, and you had people in Silicon Valley and you had people in Napa Valley, and they all shared a corridor, roughly 50 miles inland from La Jolla to Berkeley. And it represented only about 20% of the geography of the state, but about 75% of the population. Look at a map of California, politically red and blue, and it's almost all red. Look at it readjusted for population, and the balloons on the coast drown out. You can't see any red. And that's kind of a dichotomy, and it was a result of people fleeing the state and from the middle class, people coming in as immigrants that were not assimilated quickly enough for the commiserate idea that we want parity for everybody. We want middle-class citizens as quickly as possible. But most importantly, we created sort of an aristocratic class that was not subject to the ramifications of what they preach. And let me give you a few examples very quickly what I mean by that. So unfortunately, I work at Stanford University, where the per capita income of San Mateo County is about 110,000. I live in Selma, rural Selma, where it's about 12,000. And a house in Selma, a new home, is about $120 a square foot. Where I live in Palo Alto, the neighborhood is about, I rent, is about $900 to $1,500 a square foot. So it's like going from Mississippi to Massachusetts within the same state in one day, in 3 hours. And it's very disturbing, because the people who make decisions about all of us in the room, and people in Northern California, in other words, 75% of the geography of California, are not subject to the downsides of them. I'll give you a few examples. So if I had talked to Stanford professors, they're against school choice, they're for open borders, they make fun of the wall, and yet most of the people that I know with great wealth in Atherton or Bill, they have, you see Mark Zuckerberg's home, they have walled estates. What's happening in the Bay Area, it's sort of like the depressing reaction in the civil rights movement after quality of education was ensured by court decision and federal legislation. All throughout the South, we had these private academies pop up. And white people fled the public schools and put them in, it really undermined the public schools. Their defense was, there was no defense, but they would have told us, I'm consistent with my right-wing philosophy. But if you look at the Bay Area and look what's happening in Harker or Castillejo or Sacred Heart or the Menlo School, it's not consistent with their ideology. These schools are like Southern academies because this elite has lost faith in the public schools, are putting their kids in private schools, and yet are dictating how other people should operate the public schools. If you look at why we have some of the highest kilowatt rates in the United States, I go to Walmart in August, and many very poor people are sitting in Walmart because it's 110 and they cannot afford to turn on their air conditioning. The people who make those decisions are on the coast. I have an office in the tower of the Hoover tower on Stanford's campus. I've never turned on the air conditioning. There isn't any, and there's no heat. It's about 65 degrees year-round. Again, a ruling class that decides the future of California but is not subject to the consequences of often theoretical approaches. Take water. I had a conversation with a Stanford professor who was insisting that we had to cut off all the water to ag. And I suggested, why doesn't he do it to the Hetch Hetchy Deliveries California Water Project for the Bay Area? And he's pointed to the Crystal Springs Reservoir in 280. He said, we have all the water we need from ourselves. He had no idea that every drop of that water was imported from Northern California. Between Hetch Hetchy and the California Water Project, it's about 80% of the Bay Area's water. And so it's not that they're uninformed, it's almost as if they're ignorant about the sources of their own wealth. So whether it's education or power, high-speed rail is another example. I think it's great if you believe in high-speed rail, it's starting here. But if you look at the origins of that decision and you look at the lawsuits that permeated the entire project in the Palo Alto area, the Oakland area, the San Jose area, it was pretty much try it down there on those guys, not here with us. It's too dirty, it's too disruptive, we don't know what work. They're so broke down there, they'll do anything to get it. That's the attitude. And now we've got this Stonehenge that's half completed. If you've been by the overpasses, and the cost before 1 foot has been 1 foot of rail has been laid, the cost is exponentially, geometrically rising. Again, that was a project of Bay Area theorists. So let's get back to the good news, if I can. So what I'm saying is we had a natural, bountiful state. It brought in a lot of diverse people that was wonderful. And one of the things in California, we have these rich ethnic mix. Mexican people, Japanese people, Chinese people, German people. It was all sort of a natural diversity. It was not a university-enforced boutique diversity. And we had men of genius and women of genius, and we prospered, and Brown and he represented a generation of far-seeing people, and we had this wonderful utopia. And then due to, I think, complacence and too much wealth, people forgot pragmatism in the state, and we had a lot of people leave and a lot of people come, and the state started to bifurcate, so that the people who were subject geographically to the decisions of the lawmakers and the elite were ideologically, spatially differentiated. We don't know who these people are. If I go to Stanford and I say that I used to grow raisins, I had a colleague said, well, how many trees per acre do you need? And they have no idea that raisins are dried grapes and grow on a vine rather than they can be picked on a tree. And so there's a disconnect. And so what is the answer? Well, part of it is, I think the Bakersfield paradigm of all of the local paradigms we've seen is the more successful. And I'm speaking as someone who grew up with the idea that Fresno was the father and Bakersfield was the poor orphan son in the 60s and 70s. But there was something about Bakersfield's, I don't know what it was, practicality or the Oklahoma diaspora or different ethnic groups that did not really think about their differences. They thought more about their unity. It was a can-do idea. There was these rich oil reserves here. You're, I think, number 2 county in the United States in oil production. I think you're number 6 in agricultural production. You have this wonderful nexus of I-5 and the 99. You're positioned as increasingly a bedroom community. People here today have talked about all of the resources in the desert, defense, housing, but more importantly, I think, is the paradigm. And by that I mean we are coming to the natural limitations of the blue state California coastal paradigm. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is it's not functioning anywhere. Whether we look at the Oakland mayor who's in South Carolina 1858 fashion is trying to nullify federal law and say that a federal immigration cannot come in and we choose not to cooperate or even obey federal law. It would be almost as if Provo, Utah told us, I don't believe in the Endangered Species Act, or Missoula, Montana said you can buy a handgun anytime you want. Federal law doesn't apply within. We would be outraged. the federal system cannot maintain itself if individual states can pick and choose which federal laws they follow. And we learned that in 1861. If you go down, we have the highest number of homeless people in the United States. About half of everybody, about 500,000 homeless people are living somewhere in the coastal corridor, mostly. Not all, but mostly. If you look at housing prices, and you combine that with two things: great wealth concentrated coming in from all over the Pacific Rim, all over the university grid throughout the world, high tech, everybody's got an iPhone the world over, and you concentrate that area along that corridor, and then you combine it with an attitude, a utopian attitude that I really don't need to build any more dams or freeways because I've got a nice home in Portola Valley, or I live in Hillsborough, or I like my shady street in. It's sort of, I've got mine, I'm in the attic, I'm pulling up the ladder, because most people increasingly cannot afford homes because they're not building homes like they used to, because people who already have nice homes and the money to enjoy it don't want other people to have the same type of opportunities they do. So the limitations of that are pretty much been met, and I think you're going to start to see people in California that A, are increasingly dissatisfied with that model of governance, and increasingly unable to participate in it if they weren't dissatisfied. And they're going to look for other areas, and the San Joaquin Valley it's actually got a better water resource, you wouldn't believe that, but than the coastal communities. If you read what early Spanish explorers said, that you can't live along the coast, there's no water. You can live inland when you're in the watershed and the aquifer, but not along the coast. Long term, we have more land, it's cheaper, we have a different attitude, and I think you're starting to see already in Bakersfield, but also in places like Visalia and Fresno, people who left the valley as college students are starting to have families and they want to come back. They see more opportunity, and they see these local governments better run and more attuned to governance elsewhere in the United States than the peculiarity and the exceptionalism of California. I think that's going to be very positive. Second thing that I think we've seen is that we are a one-party state. That's never been successful through history. The two-party system democracy needs two rival oppositional groups to check and balance and audit and adapt and modify each other. But when you have one party, given the population concentration and the per capita wealth in the coastal area, and then this vast expanse that dilutes the conservative anecdote, then you start to see things like a party voting to make a sanctuary state in the elemental, or the ridiculous where they make it a felony to let your dog chase a bobcat, for example, where we have elemental problems. The California motto is sort of the felony that I have no ability to enforce psychologically or monetarily. I'll compensate by going after the law-abiding who commits a misdemeanor. You've all had that experience. That you can see vast infractions of the law, but there's no mechanism to address it. They're so existential. But you can be going 10 miles over the speed limit and get a $400 fine as a way psychologically and financially of compensating for that inability. And so I think that we're starting to see that this one-party state does not work. And I think you'll increasingly see, as the Mexican-American population is assimilated, it'll start to resemble the diaspora and the experience of the Italian Americans of the 1920s and 30s, who came here from a Catholic impoverished country and very quickly became democratic and were promoters of big government. And yet today, if you ask if your name is Cuomo or Giuliani, you cannot ascertain one's political beliefs. So a lot of new citizens are now taking part in California in a very fair and realistic way, and they're starting to ask themselves, I don't really care about bobcats. Transgendered restroom is not on my top of my agenda. I want to know why I pay so much for electricity. I want to know why I can't go to San Francisco on the freeway. I want to know why if I fly out of LA. And these are questions that I don't think the left and the coastal community have an answer for. A couple of other last two things that I think will make change, not by intent, but by default, is that your vote and my vote doesn't really matter in a presidential election. We saw that in 2016. In other words, when we are predictably a blue state, why would any Republican candidate come here? Comes here for one reason, to raise money and leave. 2 or 3 days and he's out of here. And that creates a sense of helplessness, or if you're on the left, it makes you dig in even more that California went 3 million votes for Hillary Clinton and yet we didn't elect her. Or why don't candidates come here? Or why, and the answer is that we're politically irrelevant. And that, I think, is starting to affect people when they say that there's only one candidate in some of these statewide races. There hasn't been a Republican statewide office holder since 2006. And that's getting people not only to look at the red state paradigm in a more fair and judicious way, but saying politics as they are in California cannot go on. We're no longer really a democracy. We're a one-state party, and we don't have any national influence. For all the talk about our great economy and high tech and the California model, the fact is that how California votes does not determine a presidential race anymore. And finally, and this is very controversial, if you've looked at some of the, we talked to our accountants, we really don't know all the details in this massive tax reform and reduction bill of 2017. But what sticks out to us and people in Illinois and people in New York, and if you can get a congressman in Washington to have a couple of drinks and be honest with you, he will tell you that this legislation was targeted at Illinois, New York, Connecticut, and California. And by that I mean there's a 10,000 rough limitation on state deductions for local and state taxes, as well as interest deductions. What that means is that affluent people who, and there's many of them in this room that are paying $100,000 or $150,000 a year in state taxes, are essentially going to see that deduction disappear, and their de facto or their effective rate's going to double. And when you add in the fact that although we're only 11th in property rate, the rate of property taxes, when you factor in assessments, we're right up there with some other states that have a 2% rate. And that means that somebody who's living in Portola Valley might have $30,000 or $40,000 property tax, and they might have they might have $200,000. In the old days, the effective rate might have been $90,000 or $100,000 with the deductions. Now it's going to be almost the whole thing. Why is that important? Besides the idea that that Republican Congress taught us a lesson, I suppose. We have 40 million people in California. Half of our revenue comes from income tax. Half of the income tax comes from how many households of 40 million pay half of the income? Anybody know? 150,000. Think of that. 150,000 out of 40 million people pay the 1/4 of the aggregate revenue and 1/2 of the income tax. If you were to lose 10,000 people because they might want to flee in a way that the middle class had traditionally fled, it would be disastrous to the state. I speak a lot for the Hoover Institution's Board of Overseers. I just got back at Palm Springs, and I had in dinner, I talked to 4 people, just 4 randomly people. They're all leaving the state because many of these affluent people are retired and they no longer have businesses, or their businesses can be run de facto or in a vicarious manner, and they're going to places like Boise and Nevada, or they're going to Texas, or they're going to Arizona. And it doesn't take many of them for us to have a revenue default. But the flip side of it is when somebody in the California legislature, and this has happened if you've been following the news, says, well, we have to raise the income tax rate up if people leave. Well, you can imagine if people left at an effective top rate of 13, if you went to 15, it would be a stampede. So I think we're getting to the limitations of what that's going to happen. So that the Congress was saying to California, you can raise taxes all you want, but we're going to put a lid on how high you can tax people, because if you go much higher, people can't afford, because they're not going to write it off at other states' expense. Let me just review then what I'm trying to suggest to you, that we are the richest state in the Union. We're one of the rare climates and geographies, whether we Bay, ports, San Diego, San Francisco Bay. Everybody who came here in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century called it paradise. Then people understood that paradise and developed it in a responsible, far-seeing fashion. Democrat and Republican, liberal and conservative. Pat Brown said, I get up in the morning, I want 2 things. I want a person to get an education so they can vote, and I want a man to be able to get to work and back safely and quickly on our freeways. Think of that. It worked so well, human nature being what it is, that we created a wealthy class that had utopian and theoretical ideas, and they did not remember the lessons and the pragmatism of their ancestors, and they started to do things, radical limitations on growth, radically high taxes, radically high ideas of redistribution, radically ideas of the salad bowl and identity politics, rather than making the way we look incidental rather than essential to our characters. And in the process, we did not keep up with the growth. We forgot who we were and why we came here and what had made us what we are. And now I think, in a very perverse way, we've come to the limitations of that blue state model. And it's not because they're nice people are going to stop, but it doesn't work anymore. I just got back from Market Street in San Francisco, and it reminded me something like a city in Latin America, not to be unfair to Latin America, but it's Market Street looked like a third world, or a community, homeless community in Orange County looks like a third world. There's problems that we haven't seen. I was in San Diego 2 weeks ago, and people said, be careful, we had a hepatitis epidemic among homeless people. And that model is not working, and when people turn to an alternative, I think what you are doing in Bakersfield is going to be the obvious alternative and superior choice, and I think we'll start to see changes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you again. And we're wrapping up, and so now you'll be able to enjoy a nice lunch. And with Nick coming up on stage too. Thank you for all the sponsors, obviously the platinum sponsor, Adventist and Health and Kaiser, Permanente. And we look forward to seeing you in 2019. Yes. And Nick will tell you the exact date in 2019.
Actually, I don't know that, but I just want to again thank all of you for being here and thank our sponsors. Thank you for supporting this event and so graciously supporting it for nearly 18 years now. And appreciate all of you, and I hope this was enlightening, and we'll see you next year.